Okay, so we may begin now. Thank you all very much for being back with us today at this afternoon event of the second day of the first International Congress on Logic, Epistemology, and Methodology of the University of Costa Rica. It is for me a great honor to present you both the speakers for this section, which are going to be Professor Paul Boghossian and Professor Sanford Goldberg. We will begin with Professor Boghossian's speech in a couple of minutes. So I will now switch to Spanish to explain the instructions. Okay, bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos por acompañarnos. Muchísimas gracias. Para este bloque tenemos las conferencias a cargo del doctor Paul Boghossian y del doctor Sanford Goldberg. Comenzaremos en primer lugar con la conferencia del doctor Paul Boghossian. Al igual que en las secciones anteriores, se les recuerda que si desean formular una pregunta al final de la conferencia, por favor, escribir un mensaje privado, en este caso escribir un mensaje privado a mí que contenga la letra Q, y entonces procederemos en orden. Procederemos a dar la palabra en orden para que ustedes formulen la pregunta. En este caso, hay un tiempo total de 1 hora y 40 minutos para cada conferencia. En principio, la distribución esperada es un máximo de 1 hora para la exposición del ponente y 40 minutos para la retroalimentación del público. Entonces, bueno, se les recuerda nada más que por favor mantengan sus micrófonos apagados y que ambas conferencias se desarrollarán completamente en inglés. Entonces, si desean formular una pregunta, por favor la realicen en inglés. Entonces, ahora hablaré en inglés para remarcar lo mismo y para introducir al conferencista. Okay, so as I was saying, we will now begin with the presentation. Before it, I will introduce to you Professor Boghossian. So Professor Boghossian is Silver Professor at the New York University, where he is currently chair of the department, having also held this position for 10 years from 1994 to 2004. Professor Boghossian earned his bachelor in physics at Trent University in 1976 and his PhD in philosophy at Princeton in 1987. In addition to his current position at NYU, he was professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor from 1984 until 1992, and has also been a visiting professor at Princeton before. He has also published 2 books entitled Fear of Knowledge Against Relativism and Constructivism in 2006, and with other authors, Content and Justification Philosophical Papers in 2008. As well as multiple articles in specialized journals in fields such as epistemology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language. Finally, he has held a very fruitful ongoing correspondence with Crispin Wright and also takes part in an extraordinary 15-year-long debate with Timothy Williamson about analyticity and the a priori, which, by the way, we are going to be recreating this next Friday at 11 o'clock here in Costa Rica. So you're all invited to that space too. So, well, as I said before, we will now hear Professor Boghossian for around 1 hour. After he finishes, we will go to the Q&A. And if you want to ask a question, you please write me a private message and I will give the word to you. So with no more to say for the moment, I will now give the word to Professor Boghossian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis, and congratulations to the philosophers at the University of Costa Rica for putting together such an impressive international conference. I guess it's one of the small benefits of the current situation that we can so quickly put together an international conference of this caliber. But let's hope that it's not going to be our indefinite future to meet on Zoom like this, or exclusively on Zoom. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have a handout, which I should, I guess, put up on the screen. I apologize that it has, on some pages, way too many words on it for a proper handout. Can you see the handout on the screen?
Yes, we can.
So, as my title, as I say, is Kripke, Quine, the Adoption Problem and the Empirical Conception of Logic. And this is joint work with Crispin Wright. I begin with the observation that there is a difference between the sentence, "It's sunny," and the sentence, "If it's sunny, then it's sunny." The first one looks like it will require empirical justification. If it is to be justifiably believed, you've got to open your eyes and have a look. Or testimony, which would depend on that. But in the case of the second, it looks to be not only a priori, as we say, but what I call epistemically analytic, that is, justifiably believable, merely in virtue of being understood. And a similar point goes for the inferential versions of this. So, for the inference, if it's sunny, then it's warm. That would be empirical, but the inference from "it's sunny, so it's sunny" would appear to be epistemically analytic, that is, justifiably believable just in virtue of being understood. A helpful distinction that I will just mention here is between weak a priori justification and strong a priori justification. This is a distinction made by Hartree Field. So if a belief that P has a weak a priori justification, that means it's been justified without the benefit of sensory evidence. If it has strong a priori justification, then it means it has weak a priori justification, but furthermore cannot be refuted by purely empirical considerations. Now, in Two Dogmas, as we all know, Quine outlined a conception of the philosophy of logic, according to which no logical truth or inference can be either strongly or weakly a priori justified. And he summarizes this conception in this very memorable passage, which you will all be familiar with. "Any statement can be held true come what may if we make drastic enough adjustments in the system. Even a statement very close to the periphery can be held true in the face of the experience by pleading hallucination or by amending certain statements of the kind called logical laws. Conversely, by the same token, no statement of revision. Revision, even of the logical law of the excluded middle, has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics. And what difference is there in principle between such a shift and the shift whereby Kepler superseded Ptolemy, or Einstein Newton, or Darwin Aristotle?" So this is a very famous resonant passage. And you can see that the rejection of strong a priority of logic is explicit, and the rejection even of weak a priority is implicit in the way in which it assimilates logic to empirical theory in general. And so this passage has come to be the kind of clarion call of what we might call the anti-exceptionalist conception of logic, which says that insofar as its epistemology is concerned, logic is no different to empirical theory. And through Quine's vast influence, we have become used to this type of view, and I think a little bit too inured to its shock value. But it is shocking because it's very hard to see how it could be right to claim that such propositions as, and I'm sorry, they're not on the handout, but they're nothing special, if P, then P, or if for all x fx, then A is F, and modus ponens, if P and if P then Q, or their corresponding inference patterns, might count as refuted if rejecting them would help with simplifying quantum mechanics. I mean, that's just a remarkable connection to think that, things that are so hard to deny, would count as refuted if somehow rejecting them helped with microscopic physical theorizing. Okay. Now it's true, of course, that we have found, occasionally have found, and might find some more, that some seemingly intuitive, self-evident logical principles lead to paradox, so that something needs to be revised. So intuitive evidence about basic logic is not infallible, but paradox-driven revision of logic would be revision of logic on a priori grounds, not on empirical ones. How did Quine propose to make this fairly counterintuitive view plausible? Well, as readers of Two Dogmas know, Quine's first move is to try to undermine the idea of the analytic. And in particular, one important notion of the analytic, namely the idea that you could get to be justified in believing something just by understanding it, right? Because if you could, then, well, maybe you could add some empirical justification to it, but the justification wouldn't always be completely empirical. But having done that to his satisfaction, he then considers how else logic might be justified. And of course, his answer is that it is like everything else. The justification is at bottom empirical. How do we make sense of that? Well, in just the way that Quine tries to do, by arguing that logic is just another, albeit central aspect of the web of belief, and that everything in that web earns its positive epistemic status by being part of the best, simplest, and most effective overall empirical theory of the world. Thus, just as all swans are white keeps getting better confirmed as we observe more and more white swans and no non-white swans, so too does, if all swans are white, then this swan is white. That too earns its keep by continued, as it were, empirical confirmation. And just as all swans are white might need to be relied on the observation of some non-white swan, if bleeding hallucination proves not to be a viable response, so too might, if all swans are white, then this one is white, if the overall theory runs into something recalcitrant, to which the best response would be to reconsider unrestricted universal instantiation. So in short, everything gets to have the very same justification as everything else. We can distinguish here in the Quinean conception two different theses: the empirical confirmation thesis and the empirical revision thesis. So the empirical confirmation thesis says that everything acquires confirmation by earning its keep in empirical theorizing and not coming under any kind of doubt. And the second, that anything, including the most basic logical laws, could be revised if it conferred certain kinds of benefit on empirical theorizing. Now, I think it's largely because we don't have, in fact, a very good account of how logic could be a priori, that Quine's idea has had enormous influence and perhaps even could be called hegemonic. And a notable example of Quine's conception was Putnam's proposal in the 70s or late 60s that the empirical successes of quantum physics gave us reason to reject the classical distributed law principles for conjunction and disjunction. Now, in 1974, Sol Kripke gave a seminar at Princeton in which he argued that Quine's anti-exceptionalist view of logic depended upon a confusion of logical belief and inferential practice. If you paid attention to this distinction, Kripke seemed to want to say, you would find that the claim that any logical law or inference pattern, no matter how basic, could in principle be rejected on purely empirical grounds and an alternative be adopted in its place is unsustainable. And we're fortunate now to have a transcript of that lecture, and this has given rise to a very considerable recent literature on this so-called adoption problem, where the adoption, it's claimed that the Quinean conception commits itself to any logical principle being in principle adoptable, and Kripke is going to show that there is in fact a problem in supposing that in full generality, any basic logical principle could be adopted, thereby refuting a central pillar of the Quinean conception of logic. Now, what I propose to do in this talk, I don't know how much of it I'll be able to get to, is I first of all want to look at the original adoption problem, the one that is presented by Kripke in his lectures and very nicely articulated by Romina Padró in her dissertation and in subsequent papers. I will then argue that the original adoption problem has a couple of vulnerabilities that give the anti-exceptionalist wiggle room to reject it. They are controversial, and one could easily see grounds for rejecting them. However, what Crispin and I try to do is use that discussion as a springboard for developing a new adoption problem, thereby vindicating Kripke's original insight into this, but we give an argument that is different from his and that has different implications for the philosophy of logic. So first, the original adoption problem, then we'll see what might be resisted about it, then we'll develop our own new adoption problem, which we call the lambda operator adoption problem, and then we will look at what the implications might be of that new adoption problem for the epistemology of logic. It's a handful, and I haven't really timed myself or anything, so we'll see how we go. Now, the first thing we need to do is look at some preliminary notions involving rule following and inference. So first thing is, we need to, that is too much. We need to, when I scroll down, is the handout scrolling down as well? Good.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I'm not very familiar with the sharing screens. So one important distinction, of course, is between believing in the soundness of a logical principle and using that principle in your reasoning. It's the distinction that Charles Peirce referred to following the medievals as the distinction between your logica docens and your logica utens. And the main examples of the basic logical rules that are involved in this discussion have been universal instantiation and modus ponens, and we will work with the following cartoon versions of these rules. The niceties, which one should get into if one wants to formulate them correctly, won't be relevant for present purposes. So for any predicates f and g, given a premise to the effect that all f's are g, you may infer this if f is g, as the cartoon version of ui, and modus ponens for any propositions p and q, given premises to the effect that p and if p then q, you may infer q. Now, we presumably understand well enough, at least as well as we understand belief, what it is to believe these principles to be sound. But what is it to have a practice of inferring with such rules? Now, a common thought is that to have a practice of following a rule, any rule, and in particular this kind of rule of inference, is not just a matter of being disposed to conform to it, but requires some kind of cognitive downwards connection from the content of the rule to the disposition to conform to it. And we can call this guidance rule following. So to have a practice of following a rule R is to be disposed to conform to R as a result of guidance by R. Now, some philosophers, including some of my colleagues, find this to be too rich a notion of rule following, at least in full generality. And they are happier with something that we might just call conformity rule following, or some people refer to as a dispositional account of rule following. So it is to have a practice of following a rule R is to be appropriately disposed to conform to R. Now you need that appropriately there because, you know, mere rule conformity is clearly not enough for rule following. The planets conform to rules, they move in elliptical orbits, but they're not following any rule. So the pure dispositionalist needs to do something about that, and they either talk about ideal conditions or they talk about second order dispositions to correct, although why that would count as correction is left unclear, etc. But we will not here try to take a stand on this issue, but we bring it up in part because, as we will see, the kind of notion of adoption that Kripke and Padrot are interested in is committed to guidance rule following. So the way they characterize adoption involves the notion of guidance. So to see this, let's turn to asking what it is to adopt a logical principle in the relevant technical sense being targeted by Kripke and Padrot. In the relevant sense, this notion of adoption is what I will call free, explicit adoption. Now, free in the sense that the agent is not committed to the validity of the pattern of inference in question merely as a result of understanding the ingredient conceptual notions. Okay. So merely in virtue of understanding all, it doesn't follow that you see that the pattern instantiated by universal instantiation is valid. So, and explicit in the sense that you've got to be moved to the practice in question, namely inferring according to UI, in virtue of explicitly considering a formulation of UI and having that contextually guide you. So that's why I said, since this notion in this strict sense involves both of these elements, the notion of adoption is committed to guidance rule following, and it's also committed to the rule being adopted, R, let's call it, not being epistemically analytic in either of the two senses that I distinguish in my own work. That is, neither constitutively analytic, where the rule, where operating with the rule is constitutive of your understanding of the relevant concept, or where you can simply by reflection on the concept itself see that the pattern of inference in question is valid, as would be the case if you grasp the notion of is taller than, okay, and on that basis came to see that is taller than has to be transitive. Now, I will say more about this later on, but I'll just flag it here. Moreover, we just assume that any rule can be represented in this way. If conditions of type C obtain, one may, mustn't try, etc. So what's the argument for the original adoption problem? Well, a natural thought is that guidance rule following is always inferential rule following. So that the way in which a general conditional statement is going to guide your behavior is going to require you to infer from the general statement of the rule, what is called for in the particular circumstances that you find yourself in, and acting accordingly. So the guidance here, which is fixed, is understood inferentially. And you know, we often do follow rules inferentially, without a doubt. For instance, in chess, if you want to see whether you may castle, you consider the conditions that have to obtain for your castling to be permitted, and you check that those conditions are satisfied, and you infer that you may castle, and then you may or may not castle on that basis. So similarly, on this picture, if you have an inferential model of rule following and you apply it to this rule of inference, then you'd have to reason, well, I have the premises that all swans are white. UI tells me that given the premise of that form, I may infer any instance of the form specified. So I may indeed infer to this if a swan is white. And now, if we have that inferential model of rule guidance, we see that there really is an adoption problem for both UI and MPP, because they will both have the following form. If you have premises of such and such a character, you may infer a conclusion of thus and so a character. And an application of either rule to generate guidance about a particular case will thus require both instantiation and detachment. This is on the inferential model. So on the assumption of the inferential model, it appears that there is an adoption problem for both, at least for both MPP and UI. So before looking at whether there is a problem here for the Quinean, before looking at whether there's a problem with this argument, let's consider what its significance for the Quinean conception of logic might be if it were conceded. Now, one point to make is that it's not immediately clear how it would bear on the confirmation thesis, because you know, what we said is that the Quinean conception has both a confirmation aspect and a revision aspect. And the confirmation thesis just says that confirmation continues to accrue as this thing works its way in empirical theory and doesn't come under any suspicion. But that doesn't seem to embroil it in any thesis about the practitioners adopting UI in the specified technical sense. So it's hard to see how an adoption problem of the kind that Kripke and Padrot have would bear on the confirmation thesis. On the other hand, the revision thesis does look to be more directly effective, because a proposal to rationally revise some aspect of our existing logical practice requires that you explicitly identify the culprit in question, and typically, we will look at scenarios where this happens and scenarios where it doesn't, but typically suggest an explicitly formulated alternative in its place, whose adoption is then supposed to contextually guide the change in the inferential practice. And if you could show that there is a problem with this notion of adoption, then certainly the thesis that says you can always revise and adopt an alternative can't be true in full generality, because there will be some logical principles that won't be adoptable in that sense. Now, however, fortunately for the anti-exceptionalist, I think there are at least two big vulnerabilities in the argument for the original adoption problem as I've just laid it out. The first one stems from the assumption that the argument needs to make, and it's what we call the already assumption here on page 4. The way the argument works is it says, look, a rule given as an explicit statement, cannot contextually guide subsequent inferential practice unless the inferential dispositions which need to be exercised in applying it are already in place independently and in advance of receipt of the explicit statement. Okay, that's the so-called already assumption. But you could ask, in the spirit of poking holes at this argument, why do the relevant inferential practices already have to be in place? Why couldn't it be the case that receipt of an explicit statement of UI, for example, go on contextually to inform both regular first-order applications and the higher-order applications that are putatively involved in one's recognition of the license the explicit statement provides for any first-order applications? So there is a hole there. I mean, it looks as though this assumption should be true, but I couldn't find a way of arguing for it. And so it is a vulnerability that somebody may exploit in seeking to reject the original adoption problem. The second vulnerability is, I think, even more severe, and that is the reliance that the argument has to make on the inferential model of guidance. That is, it has to assume that whenever a general conditional rule guides your behavior contextually, that is via its content, it has to do so inferentially by your inferring something from the content of the rule and doing what it calls for under the circumstances. But it's quite clear for two big reasons that that the inferential model of contextual guidance is not mandatory. The first has to do with a very general argument, which is something I described in a paper in 2008 called Epistemic Rules, which is to point out that if you combine an inferential model of rule following along with a rule following model of inference, you will get this kind of instability. One of them will have to go because it will generate a super task to follow any rule. So the idea is, if you think of following a rule as involving an inference from the formulation of the rule, and you think of inference, as we have been doing, as involving general rules that you follow, you will get a problem no matter what else you're doing, and in particular, whether or not you're interested in the notion of adoption. So since we are already highly implicated in a rule-following model of inference, where when you do a modus ponens inference, that is the exercise of a general capacity to follow rules of that form. There you already have reason to give up on the fully general claim that rule following always involves inference. So that's number one. Number two is we could think of examples, quotidian examples, in which we seem to follow rules, but without always having to infer. So for example, you might be a tennis player who forms the policy that they will answer something that comes to the left in this way and something that comes to the right in this way, and you will then act on that general policy without constantly having to infer what it calls for, but rather automatically. Or you consider an email rule, which I've discussed, which in order to prevent things from drifting down in the inbox and never being seen again, you answer any email that calls for an answer immediately upon receipt. And it seems as though one can act on that rule without always having to infer what it calls for in the circumstances. Now, I used to think that making theoretical sense out of the notion of non-inferential guidance by a general conditional rule non-inferentially was quite hard, but I've come to think actually that it's not that hard and can be clarified quite effectively. I won't, I guess, do that here because I'm mindful of the time, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if people wish. So, I mean, if these points are true, then the anti-exceptionalist has some very significant wiggle room getting out of Kripke's original adoption problem, because they can question both the already assumption and the inferential model of guidance, and it won't be ad hoc that they do so. However, what Crispin and I think, having thought about Kripke's argument, is that although it's vulnerable in this way, there is in fact a significant difficulty of exactly the kind that he was after, with the free adoptability of basic logical principles, but not for exactly the reasons that Kripke gave. And so what I'll try to do next is develop our version of a free adoption problem for basic logical principles. So consider Padrot's example of the fictional Harry. Harry does not yet have the practice of universal instantiation. He's not disposed to infer this F is G from an acceptance of the statement all F's are G. He is supposed to have some kind of understanding of the universal quantifier, but not, as I say, one that commits him to the rationality of being a UI inferrer, because if it did, then it wouldn't be a candidate for free adoption. So it has, that bit has to be part of the stipulation. The question is whether he can rationally come to appropriately extend his practice of becoming a UI inferrer by receiving a suitable statement of the rule of UI, along with some empirical Quinean reasons for believing the rule to be sound. So the question is, can someone whose understanding of this quantifier so far gives him nothing in virtue of which he might recognize a commitment to the practice of UI, freely adopt UI, that is, explicitly take it on board as a new rule, and thereby institute a practice of inference in accordance with that pattern? Well, you have to ask yourself, suppose you do give Harry a statement of UI. How is he to understand any particular general statement of UI that he may be given? Such a statement will itself embed something equivalent to universal quantification. So if Harry parses it, if he receives it, as it were, in terms of the instantiation neutral understanding of the quantifier that he had before he got the statement, then what he thereby understands is nothing that he can use to derive and practice the new pattern of inference that the statement is intended to mandate for him. So if an understanding of the explicit statement of UI were to somehow prompt him into the appropriate extension of the inferential practice, this prompting cannot be viewed as contentual guidance, as teaching given to him just by the statement of UI itself, but must somehow work in some other way as to trigger a shift in his understanding of Quotes-all. So this is the germ of the new adoption problem that we believe we have unearthed, even after we discard the inferential model of rule guidance. Remember that argument for that turned on the inferential dispositions already being in place and the inferential model of rule guidance. This new point, though, is not about any of those things. It is that however contentual guidance is supposed to work, the understanding that Harry has of the principal logical operator in a statement of a given inferential rule can only guide him towards a practice in conformity with it, whatever it was, i.e. with his prior understanding. Accordingly, he cannot be contextually guided towards any change in his practice by the explicit statement. So that's the nub of it, and now the generalization. Basically, you see what the generalization is supposed to be. Any rule whose characteristic inferential profile involves the use of an operator that the rule effectively implicates is going to be subject to this difficulty. Let me say that again. In order to be available for free adoption, R, the rule, must be a new rule, independent of one's antecedent grasp of its principal operator lambda. But if all one gets by way of explanation of the new inferential practices it ordains is just a statement of R, one has no basis but to interpret that statement in terms of the very notion of lambda that it is supposed to supersede, and so will be offered no path to the novel practices the rule is supposed to encode. Thus, there is indeed an adoption problem for a wide class of logical notions and associated rules, and in contrast with the OAP, it arises independently of the already assumption and the inferential model of rule guidance. Now, how wide a class of operators? Well, obviously we're talking about a logical notion. We'll say that the logical notion is basic, just if a canonical statement of its characteristic inferential profile must essentially involve meta-theoretic use of a counterpart of lambda itself. We'll call these lambda operators, and the preceding points that I made about the adoption problem applies to any lambda operator and its characteristic inferential profile. Of course, within a given language or idiolect, some connectives will be semantical primitives and others will be definable in terms of them. That's where our notion of a lambda operator is clearly relative to what the choice of the semantical primitives is in any given case and what's definable in terms of them. But that's a choice that will have to be made for any given language or idiolect. And so once that's fixed, the notion of a lambda operator is defined accordingly. Now, suppose this is right, what are the consequences for the Quinean conception of logic, of this new adoption? We call it the LOAP, the lambda operator adoption problem, not to be confused with the notion of a lambda function already in existence. So let's look first at the confirmation thesis. Remember, the Quinean conception is the confirmation thesis and the revision thesis. Let's say that a justification for an accepted hypothesis H of an empirical theory is Quinean, just in case it consists in the discovery that the theory performs well by whatever criteria are deemed appropriate before the tribunal of experience and would work less well if deprived of H. Quine's idea, and that of contemporary anti-exceptionalists, is that the logic, including the basic logical principles, which an empirical theory incorporates, insofar as it admits of any justification at all, admits at most of Quinean justification in this sense. So one moral, it seems, of our LOAP is that this claim is unsustainable. You see, let's go back to Harry, and let's just work with the example of UI. And recall, Harry has some kind of understanding of all, but so far no practice of universal instantiation. There are two cases to consider. First, suppose that UI is not a candidate for free adoption for Harry, but rather that the inferential practice in accord with UI is indeed somehow built in to his understanding of all, either in the sense of an inferential role semantics, or in the sense in which the admissibility of inference via transitivity is built into an understanding of is taller than. Maybe it's like that, but it simply hasn't occurred to him that this is so. Then intuitively, Harry already has a justification for adopting UI, the same species of justification that someone has on whom it dawns for the first time that is downstream of is a transitive relation and accordingly adopts a principle to that effect. So the anti-exceptionalist claim that the only justification one can have for a basic logical principle is Quinean cannot be sustained in this first case. Well, then look at the second case. Suppose instead that UI is a candidate for free adoption by Harry. Nothing in his prior understanding of all commits him to accepting it. Can he acquire a Quinean reason to do so? It seems not. It's no good just spontaneously accepting what we would regard as an adequate formulation of UI and seeing what payoffs accrue from working with it. There won't be any payoffs since he won't be disposed to apply the principle in the way that will be needed in order to generate them, but will understand them in the old instantiation neutral way as before. And for the same reason, it's no good giving him a statement like I've got on the handout benefit plus if you fall in with this extension of your previous pattern of use of all, you may expect the following benefits. Since all being a lambda operator, the characterization we offer of the extended practice will already have to incorporate an understanding of this extended practice if it's to help him at all. So far, one application of the LOAP to Quine's confirmation thesis. Now, you might think, look, even if I concede that something along these lines is going to work against the confirmation thesis, how damaging is that really to the Quinean view? It might be thought not very for two distinct or related reasons. One of them is that you might think that all that this kind of epistemic analyticity, that is understanding-driven justification, can give you is not a real justification for believing a logical principle, but something more like a rationale. Okay. Because maybe a similar rationale could be given for somebody using the concept tonk, because presumably you don't want to say that the person is really justified in inferring anything from anything. But you can see how, as it were, if you're employing tonk and you know its constitutive rules, you would have a rationale for doing that. And second objection is that even if we allow that the lambda operator in question is, unlike tonk, a legitimate concept, it might seem that there's still a question whether the concept in question is optimal or even a good one for a thinker to use in empirical theory. So these are two ways of saying, look, even if we concede that something along the lines of what you described is correct, the impact is minimal because, first of all, the operator in question might be like tonk, and secondly, it's consistent with saying that this concept is legitimate and this is its constitutive inferential profile, and so you're justified in employing it. However, who says that that makes it a good or even an optimal concept to be using in empirical theory? Now, I think the first question isn't really worth taking that seriously because it's arguable that tonk expresses no real concept since its constitutive rules aren't coherently followable. By contrast, if and all not only seem to be perfectly fine, they or something very like them are arguably indispensable for any thought more sophisticated than the most elementary. And in any case, it does seem to border on the incoherent to suppose that, strictly speaking, we can't know that if P then P on the basis of understanding if, but can only know that if P then P only if expresses a legitimate concept in good standing. There's the way of entering the qualification seems to rely on the very concept it's disputing. The second challenge, though, might seem more credible. Perhaps it's not out of the question to doubt whether if or all are legitimate concepts. Still, isn't it consistent to wonder whether they are the optimal concepts with which to think? And here, this would be analogous to the way in which you might be able to raise a question about geometry. Yes, of course, we understand and consider as perfectly legitimate Euclidean and non-Euclidean concepts of point and line and so on. And relative to each of those sets of concepts, their appropriate principles are correct. Still, we can raise a question which geometry is, as it were, correct about the actual world. And so maybe something similar could be asked about logic, even if we concede that certain principles are epistemically or analytically linked to their ingredient operators. But I think the analogy between logic and geometry is hard to sustain. In the case of geometry, we can make sense of the difference between pure and applied geometry, distinguishing between geometric primitives that define abstract geometric structures and those that correctly characterize the structure of physical space. What, though, would constitute an analogous distinction in the case of logic? What's the difference between pure and applied logic? If you're thinking with classical constants, double negation elimination is valid both for thought and for the real world. And if you're thinking with intuitionistic constants, it's just as invalid for both. In any case, what does works optimally well in scientific theorizing have to do with being a valid logical principle? The validity of a logical principle licenses its use in arbitrary reasoning about counterfactual circumstances, including circumstances in which physical law is hypothesized to fail. How exactly does the entrenchment of principles of inference in empirical theory that has proven to work well for our actual circumstances rationally mandate confidence in their use in reasoning about circumstances of quite another kind? So, so much for the impact of LOAP on the confirmation thesis. Let me turn now to the revision thesis. In discussing revision, as I say, I think we should distinguish between two scenarios. One in which we have a proposal to reject on empirical grounds an accepted inferential law or practice without replacement, and another in which the empirically motivated rejection of an accepted law or practice is combined with a proposal that we adopt an alternative law or practice in its place. As far as I can remember, and I wrote a paper about this as an undergraduate, Putnam's original 1969 proposal was simply that we give up the distributive principles without proposing anything in their place. So we should distinguish between, as it were, a revision that is a mere rejection of some thesis, and another scenario in which there's a rejection plus adoption of an alternative principle. Now, interestingly, I think neither mere rejection nor rejection plus adoption can be true in full generality if our LOAP is correct. So let's begin with mere rejection. it looks prima facie hard to see how an adoption problem can automatically make trouble for a proposed revision of logic that consists merely in a proposal to reject some basic rule, as I said previously. However, I think it's not right to say that mere rejection is off the hook. And to appreciate why, suppose this time that Harry, now an adult, accepts both modus ponens and UI and practices them perfectly normally in the context of an empirical theory, which is repeatedly hitting snags. Might he rationally treat these snags as an empirical reason for ceasing to practice UI and MPP? If so, the reason must presumably consist in something like acquiring forceful evidence for a proposition like benefit minus on the handout. If I fall in with the total rejection of UI or MPP practice, I could expect to avoid the problems and singularities I've been having. Well, I think it's obvious that the implementation of benefit minus in Harry's future practice, his acting on the recommendation it offers, will require him to instantiate it to particular cases and to detach across its contained conditional. So if total rejection of UI MPP is what's recommended by benefit minus, Harry won't be able coherently to rationalize action on this new policy. Of course, if the recommendation of a benefit minus type proposition were merely that we should partially restrict UI MPP practice, the instantiation / detachments might be, which implementing benefit minus would involve, might be among the permitted exceptions. I don't know, we'd need to see a worked out example. But however that may turn out, this argument is still enough to show that Quinean mere rejection cannot be true in full generality. The proposal that we might have rational reason to reject UI or MPP in toto is off the table. As for a rejection plus adoption type proposal in which the proposed adopted principles are either UI or MPP, we have already seen why no such proposal can fly. If nothing in Harry's prior understanding of all commits him to accepting UI, he cannot acquire a Quinean reason to do so. To acquire such a reason, he would have had to have accumulated powerful evidence for a proposition like benefit plus. If you fall in with this extension, and here we offer characterization of proper UI practice of your previous pattern of use, you may expect the following benefits, but as we already know, that is not going to be feasible in Harry's case because of the lambda operator nature of the quantifier involved. So there's more to the paper, but that's a good place in which to quit. We've seen that the original adoption problem has some vulnerabilities, but this new adoption problem seems to stand without those controversial assumptions and does have a very significant impact on the constitutive theses of the Quinean conception of logic. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bogosian, for this excellent talk. And before proceeding with the Q&A, some people in the public were asking if it would be possible for you to upload this handout in the chat.
Oh, yes, what a good, yes, I should have done that. For some reason, I'm having a bit of problem with that right now.
I think, yes.
Oh, I know, maybe I can do it now. File. I'm sorry, I should have done this.
So, well, in the meantime, I will remember everyone the rules. If you want to ask Professor Bogosian a question, please write me down a private message with the letter Q, and we will proceed in order, and I will give you the word. We already have a question, so we may begin. Thank you very much, Professor Bogosian, for the handout. You can now, everyone can now download it in the chat. So as I was saying, we have our first question by Professor Marisela Rojas. She wrote down the question, but if you want, Marisela, you can ask it yourself. So I will now give you the word if you want. But well, maybe I will read the question. So wait. So
hello.
Okay.
Hello. Okay. My question is for the professor. It's a beautiful, great conference. Do you consider important the Piagetian assumption of complementarity between the solidarity, epistemological solidarity between both possibility and necessity, and logical necessity, between logical intents and logical extents, between logical structure and meaning semantics sense. This complementarity, this solidarity is very important for Piagetian point of view. What do you think about it? That's my question.
Well, thank you for that question. I'm afraid I'm a little bit of a disadvantage because I don't know that much about Piaget, but what I do know and what you have just now been describing, while there might be certain points of contact, really the problem that I'm discussing today can be stated relatively independently of some of those theses that you mentioned. There is one point of contact between what logical structure and semantics, which you mentioned, which does show up, of course, in very important ways in the argument of the paper in terms of this notion of epistemic analyticity, which is that the basic logical principles, I believe, are epistemically analytic relative to the central logical operators involved in them. So, for instance, with modus ponens and if. And as I say, this can be understood in one of two ways. You don't have to be committed to an inferential role semantics in order to believe that. You could also think that the logical principle is built into the understanding of the logical operator in the way in which the transitivity of is downstream of is built into the notion of being downstream from. So where I'm assuming that it's as it were not constitutive of your having the concept of is downstream of, that you be prepared to assent to its transitivity, but nevertheless the transitivity just flows right out of the nature of the concept in question. In the same way, for instance, as in a Euclidean triangle, in fact, we call it a triangle. We really, when we define triangle, we define it in terms of its sides. But in fact, that definition has it as an immediate analytic consequence, in my sense of analytic, that it has three interior angles. So anyway, yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Now we will proceed with the next question. Now it will be time
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now it will be time for Gillian Russell. So you may proceed now, please.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for the fascinating talk.
Hi, Gillian.
So one thing that I'm a bit struck by is when I look at the people who are actually suggesting changing logics and revising logic, they're nearly always recommending a weaker logic, because classical logic is so strong. So intuitionists, strong cleaning logicians, people who are paraconsistentists, free logicians. And so it's often the case that rather than saying we should adopt some new rule, they are in that very last clause that you talked about, they should just restrict some of the older rules. So it seems like we haven't really got to the point where we're interacting with those people until we get to that situation.
I mean, part of the point of the paper was making enough of these distinctions so that you treat separate groups separately when they deserve to be treated separately. So, you know, there is, I guess the full-blown one is rejection plus adoption, right? And then another one is mere rejection. And in between mere rejection, I guess we should distinguish between mere rejection in toto versus rejection by restriction. Good? And
right.
And then, yeah, so what I said about that case is the rejection by restriction would have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis for the kinds of arguments that I'm giving, because it may be that you don't, as it were, refute yourself because the implementation of the restriction that you need is consistent with the restriction you're advocating, right?
Yeah.
But that's all fine, and I don't need to be speaking to those people necessarily. But what is already shown is that the Quinean conception in full generality is not true and could not be true. So that's the philosophical import. Now, whether there are, as it were, and you know, the restrictions, by the way, are typically on a priori grounds, not on empirical grounds. As far as I know, I don't know of restriction on empirical grounds. And that's a very important distinction for the purposes of this paper as well. There's no doubt that we get a priori grounds for worrying about logical principles. Just the paradoxes themselves show that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will proceed with the next question. Now I will give the word to Professor Lorenzo Bocafoli. So please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you very much, Professor Bogosian, for your talk. I found it very interesting and very inspiring, actually. I have more than one question. Let's say I make you one, then I would have sort of some curiosity about your collaboration and relation with Christian rights, because I'm quite interested in Frege's philosophy and systems. Okay. First question would be, I hope I didn't miss anything in your talk. Let's say I'm not a logician, and I have something like a pre-theoretical understanding of the logical connectives because I use them. Okay. But it doesn't mean that I use them consistently. It's not necessary that, so maybe in the practice I use them, they help me for something, so from an heuristical point of view and so on, but maybe are not consistent one with the other. So if I want to build up a system, I have to make changes. Okay, doesn't it mean that I have already an idea of consistency before having a system? And if it's the case, have we got just one idea of consistency outside of the system? Does this any sense? Makes this any sense? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that you know, one of the indispensable planks for any inquiry is the idea of a conflict, okay, between what your theory is predicting and what you're seeing. And it could be a conflict, as it were, a priori conflict between two principles that you endorse, or it could be a conflict between what you're claiming and what you're seeing. And so, yeah, I think, and you know, there may be different ways of articulating this conflict. The notion of negation clearly seems to be essential there. I agree. So the way you were putting it is something that I would agree with, that, you know, you have a notion of consistency that you bring to the table, as it were, as an indispensable element of inquiring about anything.
Okay.
But I may not have gotten what you were asking about.
I didn't hear the last thing you said, the last sentence.
Yeah. Well, tell me what's worrying you, and I will try to address that more directly. What?
No, it's okay. Your answer is okay. I'm thinking about this.
Okay. All right. Good.
If we have time, if there are not so many questions after my one, I would tell you my curiosities, so to say.
Okay.
But Lorenzo, please, let's leave that to the end.
Okay, right. No problem. No problem. Right.
Okay. Thank you. So now we will proceed with the question of Kevin Davey. So you now have the word, please.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much again for the wonderful talk. So, right, I'm trying to think through this lambda operator stuff. So can you help me think through it a little bit? So just looking at your handout here, we say that a logical notion is basic, just if a canonical statement of its characteristic inferential profile must essentially involve metatheoretic use of a counterpart of lambda itself. Okay, so so how are we to think then about disagreement about what the canonical statement of some concept's characteristic inferential profile is? Is that a different sort of disagreement from the sorts of disagreements that the rest of your talk was about? Or and if it is a different sort of disagreement, how can we make sense of disagreement about exactly what the canonical inferential profile of a concept is? Can you help me think through those questions, if they're clear enough?
Yeah, you'd have to say in what respects there is a disagreement about the inferential profile.
Yeah. So, you know, so the intuitionist, you know, has certain views about double negation, and, you know, the classicist has different views, and so they just see the profile of negation differently. Is a sort of just basic case I'm thinking about.
Right. Okay. But I'm assuming that the right account is that these are not real disagreements. In that sense, they're analogous to the so-called dispute between Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry. Okay. They configure their own concepts. Of point and line in the case of geometry, and negation in the case of classical versus intuitionistic logic. But the point is that, you know, if you, I mean, and I'm pick the extreme example of Harry, Romina's creation, or maybe Saul's creation, who doesn't have a practice at all of UI, then it's quite clear that simply being given formulations of UI are not going to help them acquire that practice. Where acquiring the practice doesn't just mean slipping into it, but being contextually guided by the formulation of the rule. Now, you know, presumably what's going on in the classical intuitionistic cases, I have both sets of concepts. I understand perfectly well. You know, so what we're arguing about is, you know, which of them is correct, which of them is guaranteed to be truth preserving, or maybe we're arguing about which of them is guaranteed to do a better job in physical theory. You know, I can make sense of that. I don't see the relevance of that to the truth, the soundness of the principles, but I can make sense of that. The situation we're looking at, and something that the Quinean, you see, has to make sense of, at least under certain scenarios, is where you don't have a concept that already gives you a rationale for inferring in a certain way, and come to acquire a rationale for inferring in that way. So that your justification is exclusively empirical.
Okay, thanks. That clarifies some things. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. Now we will proceed with the question of Graham Priest.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Graham.
That was a great talk. I was delighted that you set things up so carefully, because in previous discussions of this I've heard, a lot of important distinctions got just obliterated, which you did not do. So I think that's fantastic. For the most part, I think that my kind of anti-exceptionalism is compatible with what you say. I've got a few minor quibbles, but nothing very significant, I think. I think there's just one point where I'd be inclined to take issue with what you said. And that's when you have this scenario where you're considering revision without replacement. Okay. So look, you set up the situation like this. I'm not sure it's the only way to set up, but let's run with it. You're in this situation and you discover, hey, if I reason thus and such, then I'm in trouble. To have a reason to not reason thus and such, you've got to apply modus ponens, and so you seem to be presupposing modus ponens. I take it that's the argument. Okay, now the reason I think it's not quite so straightforward is this. Suppose I reason, if I reason thus and such, then I'm in trouble. Okay, so I'd normally do reason thus and such, I'm in trouble. Okay, so I've got to do something, right? There are three possible reactions. Don't reason thus and such, modus ponens is invalid, or live with the trouble. Those are the three possibilities, right? Let's suppose that I can't live with the trouble, just to keep things simple. Then I got two choices. Don't reason thus and such, or give up modus ponens. So one response might be, well, give up modus ponens. Now, you know, what the right response is, we might have to do all kinds of things to try and figure out. But it seems to me that as a result of this kind of cogitation, it could be rational to give up modus ponens. Moreover, if your theory, if you reason thus and such, then you're in trouble. If you've got a theory which says don't use modus ponens anyway, then that might be a sensible way of doing it. So that's the sort of thought I had.
Thank you very much for that. I know that what you're saying is tempting, and I may have missed something right at the end because somebody came in through the door. But just in response to what you said, that you know, I think is a very tempting thought. That given that it's one of the options, why isn't it one of the options? Roughly, to put it like that.
Yeah.
And the answer is that, you know, it should be possible. It looks like a requirement on my step from A to B being a rational one, that I be able to look back when I'm in B at the step from A to B and say, yeah, that was the right thing to do. This is going to be very hard to do if, having got there via modus ponens, I then look back and say any reasoning by modus ponens is shaky.
No, I don't see that, Paul. I mean, what you know is that if you reason by modus ponens, you end up in trouble. You've got to do something, right? No, and it doesn't matter how you got there. You've got to do something to get rid of got you into trouble.
No, it does very much matter how you got there. You got there by a modus ponens reasoning.
Yeah, but that just show that modus ponens is the thing that's causing you the trouble.
but you got there by modus ponens reasoning. I mean,
yeah, you got there by something that's causing you trouble, so give it up.
Yeah, but it's not, you're making it sound like it's a pill I don't have to take anymore. It's not like that. Looking back at the rationality, look, the reason I have reason to think of giving up modus ponens depends on modus ponens. That's the only reason I've got. So it can't be that these things are not good reasons, but I now have good reasons for taking them seriously. That's the fear. Anyway, I grant you that I've heard both sides of this debate. But I think there is very much something too, I hope you'll admit, the idea that it's got to be retrospectively vindicable.
Oh no, I don't think that's true. It's got to be a move that gets you out of the trouble.
All right.
Okay, and it had better stack up by the new position you get to, because the old one was leading you trouble.
We're going to have to agree to disagree on that.
I'm happy to agree to disagree. We can take that up over a beer.
Thank you, Graham. That was great.
Okay, so thank you very much. Now we have another question by Lorenzo, so you may now proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. It was more a curiosity, so to say, a little bit outside of the paper, but your concept of an implicit definition on the basis of Dummett's pragmatical circularity has certain continuities with Crispin Wright's idea of implicit definition relative to Hume's principle.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're probably the same notion.
The same notion. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, he's putting it to ontological use.
Yeah.
Which I'm not necessarily doing. I was looking at it more from an epistemological point of view. But, I think he, yeah. So there are different uses to which it might be put, and it's a very interesting and under-theorized notion. Especially in its, as it were, implicit form, because there are explicit kinds of implicit definition and implicit kinds of implicit definition. For instance, what an inferential role semantics is an implicit kind of implicit definition. And so there are many interesting subtleties about all of this, but as far as the core notion is concerned, I think, it's the idea that you don't, it's an implicit, you don't define it by giving an equivalence to some other notions that are already antecedently understood, but rather that you define the notion by saying which sentences involving it are true or need to be held true.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously something that we need in order to make sense of meaning, because obviously there are limits to how many things can be explicitly defined, since you need some primitives in order to do any define.
And if you accept on this way, Crispin Wright's more ontological definition of implicit definition, or conception of implicit definition. And so our reference to abstract object is so some way sure, some way guaranteed. No, it's so obvious. It's possible. Would you follow a certain kind of Fregen or neo-Fregen Platonism? Would you follow him in this? If through Hume principle we have an authentic reference, okay, our reference is completely justified. Would you follow from this his idea of a neo-Fregen Platonism?
Well, that's asking about, as I say, the ontological use.
Yes.
Which I'm trying to avoid.
That's the ontological view, of course.
That's an ontological use of the notion of implicit definition.
Yes.
Generating something about the ontology, that it's Platonist ontology. Platonist ontology on the cheap, so to speak.
Yeah, I've heard something similar.
Right.
So you don't agree with this kind of ontological interpretation, basically.
Well, I'm not really taking a stand on it. I don't. It's not.
Okay. You
Yeah.
don't take stand to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm taking a stand on that right now.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. If there are no more questions, we will give a break of 5 minutes, and we will come back to hear Professor Goldberg presentation. So before the break, I just want to thank very much Professor Bogosian for this excellent talk and for his time, and everyone else that was present for this speech. And okay, now we have one last question. So
I was just about to leave.
yeah. Well, I will now leave. I will now give the word to Romina Padro.
Sorry, Paul, but I actually typed it before. I don't think Luis, didn't see it.
Sorry, that was my
No,
mistake.
I was going to let you leave without the question. Okay. No, it's about, the implicit, explicit adoption, and that you think that the original adoption problem requires this explicit adoption.
Oh.
Actually, I think that if what we are talking about is acceptance of a content of a rule, then it doesn't really matter whether it's implicit or explicit. Because I can write the rule in your brain, and not the disposition, the rule. And that would be the same problem. That would generate the same problem, because you will have to infer from it if what you get is, something propositional, implicit access to.
The difference between explicit and implicit adoption is not the difference between the rule being written outside for you on a piece of paper versus the rule being written in your brain. The difference is...
Okay, how you're understanding it.
Oh, I understand the difference to be between adopting a practice as a result. This is the explicit case. The explicit case is you contemplate a formulation of the rule and you let it guide your inferential practice.
Right.
And implicit adoption is one which is basically something that I don't think you can help yourself to, but in any event is just the disposition to conform.
Okay, no, I was thinking of something more like Chomskyan. That would not save you. You see? If you have some kind of implicit access to structure, that would not help.
I mean,
because you would be in the same situation. You had to represent and apply.
On the counter argument we gave, I mean, we don't. Very good. The notion of the tacit knowledge of a set of rules that Chomsky has to partake in is, as you know, a very important but very murky notion, which no one has really properly explained. But assuming that we think of it as a kind of subpersonal version of what happens at the personal level, conscious level, then you're absolutely right that for the purpose with the argumentative resources you're using, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the implicit or the explicit. But the trouble is what I was questioning, or we were questioning, were the argumentative resources, namely the already assumption, which you would still need to apply at the subpersonal level, and the inferential model of guidance, which you would need to apply at the subpersonal level. Very nice, actually. I'm glad you brought that up because it makes you think. But yeah, since the problem was with the resources, not with the tacitness, we could still have that discussion.
All right. Okay, I'll let you go now.
Very clarifying questions. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Romina, I didn't see your question. So now we will end with this speech, and we will give a 5-minute break. So once again, thank you very much, Professor Bogosian, and thank you very much, everyone. And in 5 minutes, we will be back to hear Professor Sanford Goldberg.
Hi, Graham. How are you?
Hi, Romina. How are you?
I'm good. So you're gonna give Saul that Sherman test again?
What?
Ah, jawohl.
Because Graham was saying that you have always to look for when I said, no, well, we aren't like that. And I gave the example of your Sherman test that you're still worrying about from college and regretting what you did. And he said he's going to give it to you again, give you a second chance, doing better. Maybe that's the way to let it go,
You better get your German books out, Saul and Spot.
No, I don't know.
Hi, Saul.
You know this story?
Oh my God, Saul, like 1,000 times.
Okay, so tell it to Graham.
The story is that there were some Jewish holidays and he could not do the test the day everybody else did, but they put it right after, so he didn't have time to study. And he got a what? A C?
No, I don't know what I got on. I don't know what I got on. It's only it lowered my grade, which would have been in trouble.
Okay. Saul, I kind of suspect it doesn't really matter now.
However, there were 3 of us. I still remember this one woman calling me up and saying, the exam is tomorrow. And look, we had to read something by, who was it? Schnitzler. We had to read something, and the way you cram for exam when I hadn't read any of this stuff, right? They were going to ask you about it, yeah. And that was true of the 2 other people with me. Like one of them.
You see, there is no statute of limitations. I mean, this is 60 years ago, and they're still regretting the exam.
No, well,
not even know I do that.
One of them may have just dropped German after that. There were 2 other people besides me, both girls, women. Right.
Well, look, Saul, if that's your major regret in life, you're not doing too bad.
I get everything in the world. Right, yeah.
I mean, yeah, the counterfactuals are a big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you going to give a talk at this thing?
Yeah.
When?
Thursday. In fact, I'm going to give the talk that's going into the Fetchrift for Saul on the Impossible Worlds.
Okay. Is it in the morning? Say now.
It is. Hang on. Here.
Well, they are 2 hours behind, so it can't be.
Okay, no, it's 5:40 in the afternoon.
Okay.
Okay, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. We'll be there.
Okay.
All right. Stay well, guys.
Bye. Good talking.
Good talking.
Okay, so welcome back. Well, I think the rules are clear by now, so I will not repeat them. So I will just introduce Professor Goldberg, and then I will give him the word. Okay, so, well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Goldberg, for being here with us. It is an immense pleasure. And well, Sanford Goldberg is Chester D. Tripp Professor in the Humanities at Northwestern University's Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. He obtained his PhD in philosophy at Columbia University in 1995. His main lines of research include epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mind. Some of his interests in epistemology include topics such as reliabilism, the epistemology of testimony, the theory of epistemic justification, social epistemology, self-knowledge, and skepticism. He has published extensively on these topics, and a good sample of his work can be found in his 5 recent books: Anti-Individualism with Cambridge University Press in 2007, Relying on Others with Oxford University Press in 2010, Assertion with Oxford University Press in 2015, To the Best of Our Knowledge with Oxford University Press 2018, and Conversational Pressure with Oxford University Press in 2020. Today, he's going to talk to us about his paper called On Speaker Expectations of Our Audience, the Case of Telling. So I will now give the word to Professor Goldberg. Thank you very much.
So I want to begin first by saying, Luis, thank you so much to you and to the others at the University of Costa Rica for inviting me. This is really a lovely, lovely thing. As Paul and the others have said, it would have been much nicer to be in Costa Rica, but that is as it is. I also wanted to say one thing to la gente de habla español. Si quieren preguntarme algo en español, me parece perfecto. Lo que pasa, voy a responder en inglés para que todo el mundo me pueda entender. Pero si quiere hacerme una pregunta en español, me parece perfecto, okay? So if anyone wants to ask me a question in Spanish, that's fine. I will be responding in English because I want to make sure that everyone can understand. But if you prefer to ask a question in Spanish, please go ahead and do so. I am going to share my screen, if I can find the right one. And it should be going well now. Luis, can you just confirm for me that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about speaker expectations of her audience. And I'm going to be focusing on the single speech act of telling. And as many of you will know within a few minutes, if you don't already, this is a topic that has attracted a tremendous amount of attention recently. And I'm going to be engaging with some of the people who have been attending to this. The overview for today is I want to do several things. I want to begin by gesturing towards the topic. Then I want to identify what I am going to call the core phenomenon. That is a speaker's expectation of what I'm going to call proper treatment. After that, I'm going to go over several what I will call failed theories of the core phenomenon. I'm going to introduce a hero. The hero, just to spoil the surprise, is Miranda Fricker. I think there's an underappreciated aspect of her book, Epistemic Injustice, that I want to highlight today before I make my own suggestions towards a correct theory of the core phenomenon. And then I will draw some big picture conclusions. So let me begin with just gesturing towards today's topic. It will surprise none of you to know that there is an epistemic dimension to speech exchanges involving testimony. This is what we call in the epistemology literature, the epistemology of testimony, and it's since at least the 1980s a well-trodden area of epistemology. Also since that time, although a little less saliently, there have been claims that have highlighted another dimension of normative assessment involving testimonial exchanges. I want to just give you a few examples of the various people who have talked about this. I begin with Elizabeth Anscombe, who in a very influential paper from the late 70s said, "It is an insult and maybe an injury not to be believed. At least it is an insult if one is oneself made aware of the refusal, and it may be an injury if others are." She's not alone in this. We have Ted Hinchman from a paper that I'm going to engage with in about 20 minutes, writing that if an audience improperly gives no credence to what he was told, this amounts to a kind of slight rebuff or abuse of the speaker. We have Richard Moran in a paper from the early 2000s, and more recently in his book that I'll be talking about in a moment, writing that certain inappropriate reactions to tellings constitute an offense against the speaker. We have Miranda Fricker saying that in cases of testimonial injustice, in which prejudice on the hearer's part causes him to give the speaker less credibility than he would otherwise have given, the audience wrongs a speaker in his capacity as a giver of knowledge, as an informant. And finally, in a really lovely paper in Phil Quarterly, Jeremy Wanderer writes that it is a testimonial insult not to have one's say-so taken seriously, as when it is not treated as a genuine input into the deliberative process. Now, the reason I find these quotes interesting is because the authors seem to use not only charged language, but normative language. They say that certain ways of responding to a speaker constitute an insult or an injury, amount to a slight, a rebuff, or an abuse of the speaker, constitute an offense against the speaker, wrong the speaker in her capacity as a giver of knowledge, or amount to a testimonial insult. And this language is what gives us our core phenomenon. I'm calling this core phenomenon, or I'm describing it as a second dimension of normative assessment bearing on an audience who confronts a piece of testimony. And I'm going to call this dimension of normative assessment interpersonal. And I'm going to call it interpersonal for the reason that I'm not entirely sure that it's moral. I'm not entirely sure that it's justice related, but I am sure that whatever it is, it's a kind of interpersonal normativity, the kind of normativity that amounts to a wrong against the speaker when it's violated. And this interpersonal dimension of normative assessment constitutes what I'm calling the core phenomenon, which we can summarize as follows: that under ordinary circumstances, speakers who perform certain types of speech acts, that is, who make claims, are entitled to expect that they will not be wronged in the ways described above. That's our core phenomenon, and I'm going to call it a speaker's expectation of proper treatment. And the question that I'm pursuing today, in my talk today, is this: why is it that in cases in which a speaker makes a claim, the speaker is entitled to expect proper treatment where this amounts to a kind of treatment that is owed to those who perform this kind of act? What I'm going to suggest is that an adequate answer to this question actually has to answer four different questions. First, it has to answer what I'm going to call the content question. And the content question talks about what type of treatment a speaker expects when she expects proper treatment. What is the treatment expected? That's the content question. Second is the entitlement question. What entitles a speaker to expect this sort of treatment? The third is what I'm calling the harm question. What's the nature of the harm that's involved when an audience violates this expectation? And the fourth, to my mind, perhaps the most interesting of all, is the epistemology question. How does the expectation of proper treatment relate to the epistemological dimension of testimonial transactions? And just to give you a sense of why I am obsessed by this topic, it strikes me that none of the theories that have tried to answer these questions has really addressed itself adequately to the epistemology question, and that's the one that ought to be driving us in this discussion, in this debate. And I'll go over this at length when I talk about the various theories of the core phenomenon. I'm going to start off with two theories that will probably be unfamiliar to most of the people in this room. And that's because these theories come from people who are neither epistemologists nor philosophers of language, at least not philosophers of language who specialize in speech act theory. These are two philosophers whose primary area is in ethics and metaethics. And yet we find them theorizing about something very close to what I'm calling the core phenomenon. I begin with what I'm going to call the demand model. And this comes from Alan Gibbard's book, Wise Choices, Apt Feelings. Here's what Gibbard has to say in that book. Conversation is full of implicit demands and pressures. Suppose I confidently expound astrology and you give no credence. The result will be discomfort. In effect, I demand that what I say be accepted and you will not accede. Now, we can look at this, what I call this demand model of assertion. Gibbard's idea seems to be that the act of asserting something, he calls it expounding, but I'm going to take him to have something in mind like assertion. The act of assertion is also an act that makes a demand of the audience that they believe what was asserted. So that's why I call this the demand model. And we can look and see how well this does in answering our four questions. What does Gibbard's theory have to say to the content question? Well, it's pretty clear that what he says is that the speaker's expectation of proper treatment is a demand to be believed. I actually think this is not a good way to think about the expectation of proper treatment, precisely because demands seem to be not the kind of thing that you can do to someone when you actually want them to believe something. If for no other reason that a demand is typically backed by practical authority, and the sort of pressure that you put on someone to believe when you tell them something is supposed to be epistemic authority, that suggests that there's something wrong in this answer to the content question. So I'm going to say it doesn't get a pass here. What about with respect to the entitlement question? What is Gibbard's answer to the entitlement question? Well, it seems as though he's saying the speaker's entitlement to make this demand to be believed is based on whatever authority underwrites the demand. And once again, because the authority that underwrites a demand is practical authority, and because what we're ultimately trying to figure out is how an active assertion can give a speaker a basis for actually believing what was asserted, I think that's not a good answer to the entitlement question either. What about the harm? Here's where I think Gibbard's theory gets a little bit more interesting. Again, when I say Gibbard's theory, I'm actually extrapolating on his behalf. He has actually said none of these things. I'm just trying to get his what he did say to bear on the questions that I'm asking. And it looks as though what his theory has to say is this, that when the expectation of proper treatment is violated, the harm to the speaker is that of having one's demand be rejected. And while I don't think that's quite right, I think there's something in it, in that idea. And so I'm going to put a question mark next to that answer rather than suggest that the answer is false. It seems suggestive in a way that we'd like to build on. What is Gibbard's answer to the epistemology question? Well, you will not be surprised to learn that I don't like the answer, because insofar as assertion involves a demand to be believed, it appears as though assertion in involving a demand to be believed does not present the right kind of credentials to an audience in order for the audience to believe justifiably. And so I think the answer to Gibbard's answer to the epistemology question is also unacceptable. A second theory that's in this ballpark, again, by another person who is someone who works primarily in the literature in ethics and meta-ethics, and who builds on Gibbard's theory, is Michael Ridge, who in his impassioned belief comes up with what I describe as the advising model of assertion. And here's what Ridge has to say in impassioned belief. He says, to assert that P is not only to express the belief that P, it's also to exert a kind of conversational pressure on one's interlocutor to adopt the belief that P. Moreover, the form of conversational pressure involved here constitutes a way of advising someone to believe the P and is not simply goading or manipulation. Now, I have to say I love this quote, in part because my impression is that Ridge, perhaps more so than Gibbard, was alive to the kinds of questions that I'm calling the questions that emerge from the core phenomenon. That is, Ridge, it has some sense that there's a kind of pressure that's put on an audience that is at one and the same time partially epistemic and partially interpersonal. And he's trying to capture this with the idea that to assert is also at the same time to advise. What are you advising your audience? That they believe what you've said. We can again ask, how well does this do on the four questions that I think any adequate theory has to answer? And I think on the first question, Ridge's account will hold that the speaker's expectation is somehow related to her advising the audience to believe her. And this gives rise to the question, what exactly do we expect of an audience when what treatment do we expect from an audience? How do we expect to be responded to when we advise them? And it strikes me that there are various things we might expect. The treatment expected from an advisee might be that one's advice will be accepted, or it might be that one's advice will be taken seriously, or, and this is perhaps my favorite, one's advice will be taken in the spirit in which it was offered, namely as backed by one's assessment of what is best for the advisee, all things considered. So we might have any one of these expectations when we advise someone. In light of the fact that I'm not entirely sure what Ridge would say to this, I'm going to put a question mark next to the content question just because I'm not entirely sure what his view will commit him to. And for the same reason, I'm not entirely sure what his view will commit him to with respect to the entitlement question. It's something like this: the speaker's entitlement to expect this is based on whatever authority underwrites the act of advising. And I'm not entirely sure, since I'm not sure what the expectation is, I'm not entirely sure how to make sense of his answer to the entitlement question either. So I'm going to put a question mark there as well. Things get much more interesting, however, when we get to the harm question and the epistemological question. Because I think what Ridge's answer to the harm question is this, that when the expectation of proper treatment is violated, the harm to the speaker is that of having one's advice rejected. And I think this is false. And the reason I think this is false is that if you think about the kind of thing that you feel when you have a piece of advice that you've offered to someone and they've rejected it, my proposal to you, and I'm hoping this is not controversial, is that you might not feel great, but you don't feel the kind of sting that the authors at the beginning of my talk were talking about in the quotes that I gave you. In particular, you might say, when your advice is rejected, it's no skin off your back. The person who suffers from this is, assuming your advice is good, is the person to whom you gave the advice. So I think the answer that the advising model gives us to the harm question is not good. More interestingly, I think the answer that it gives us to the epistemology question is not good. It would go something like this. Given that assertion involves advising the audience to believe, assertion provides epistemic support by doing something in connection with the advice to believe. But the problem is that advice, like demand, seems to be backed by authority that is not distinctly epistemic authority. And to see that, consider that my advice to you that you should do phi is good advice, just in case it would be best for you, all things considered, if you phi'd. So I might think that your life would go best if you believed, for example, that P, even though I think that P is false, I still advise you to believe it because I think your life will go better if you believe it. And insofar as that would count as good advice by the standard that I just gave you, it's clear that any conception of asserting that connects assertion to advising someone to believe is not going to give us a good answer to the epistemology question. And so I downgrade the theory there as well. So it looks like the theories that we get from the two ethicists, the people who are engaged in ethics, meta-ethics, although they have something like the core phenomenon that I had in mind, it's clear that my attempt to extract from their mini theories or their proto-theories a full, robust answer to my four questions leads to accounts that don't do well along all four of these dimensions. What I want to move now to is two authors who, starting in the mid-2000s through the contemporary day, I think have much more of a clear sense of exactly what I'm calling the core phenomenon. And I start off with a view that many of you will know. If you know the literature on testimony, you certainly will know this view. This view comes from Ted Hinchman, and it's called the invitation to trust model. I want to start off by just quoting Hinchman at length. And this, I ask when you listen to me read the quote, I ask that you appreciate how closely Hinchman has attended to the kind of phenomenon that I'm calling the core phenomenon. It's clear that he has his focus on exactly what I have my focus on. So forgive me, this first quote is rather long, but you'll have a sense of how close he is to the very topic that I'm talking about. He says the following: imagine audience A manifestly looks as if he needs to learn the time. So speaker S tells him it's noon, but A doesn't regard himself as having thereby acquired any entitlement to believe it's noon. Imagine not that A regards himself as having acquired an entitlement to believe that it's noon, that gets defeated by such background knowledge as that S's watch tends to run fast, but that A regards himself as not having acquired any entitlement, not even a now defeated prima facie entitlement to believe it's noon. Here, A is failing to acknowledge S. He is, as we say, slighting S. The explanation of S's sense of having been slighted is that she has tendered an invitation to A to trust her and has been explicitly rebuffed, unquote. Now, it's already clear that Hinchman has his eye both on the interpersonal dimension and on the epistemic dimension of testimonial transactions. But there's one more extended quote I want to give you, because here is where Hinchman gets even more explicit about what he has in mind. He says the following: we can now account for the nature of A's abuse when he fails to regard himself as coming to have an entitlement to believe that it's noon, when he fails, in effect, to take S's word for it. In telling A that P, S offers him something, an entitlement to believe that P, which she conceives as his for the taking. In recognizing her intention to tell him that P, A satisfies that intention and S thereby counts as telling him that P. But in refusing to acknowledge the entitlement, he refuses the offer she makes in telling him that P. What's at stake for S when she tells A that P is his recognition of her as worthy of his trust, unquote. Now, I'm going to try to extract from these two quotes a full theory, that is, an attempt to answer all four of the questions that I laid out. I should note again that I'm attempting to extract this, but I'll give you some argument for why I think this is the right way to read Hinchman. To begin, what is Hinchman's answer to the content question? I think Hinchman's answer to the content question is that the expectation of proper treatment is the expectation to be presumed trustworthy. My idea here is that in the very end of the second of those two quotes, when he talks about what's at stake for S, is that of being worthy of the audience's trust. Hinchman recognizes that the audience may actually have evidence which prevents the audience from trusting the speaker, but the thought is that absent that evidence, the expectation is that the speaker, in inviting the audience's trust, is worthy of that trust. And if you put those two things together, what you get is that the expectation of proper treatment is the expectation to be presumed trustworthy. Now, I think this is an interesting suggestion, but I think it's wrong. Only I'm not going to be able to convince you of that until I get to the very end of my paper. So I'm going to put a little star there to indicate that I don't take myself to have given an argument against his answer to the content question. Let's move to the entitlement question. The answer I think that Hinchman gives is that the speaker's entitlement to expect to be presumed trustworthy is based on the fact that it was mutual knowledge that she invited the audience to trust her. That's precisely what this talk of invitation to trust is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to entitle the speaker to expect to be presumed trustworthy, and it's also supposed to entitle the audience to believe what the speaker said on the speaker's authority. But if we focus just on the entitlement question, I think that is a fair statement of his view. I think this is a false theory, a false answer to the entitlement question. But to convince you of that, I need to give you a story that has nothing to do with telling, and I call this the chocolate affair. Suppose that I know that you love excellent chocolate and that you don't love bad chocolate. And suppose that I know that you actually are in a chocolateless condition right now. Suppose, in fact, that not only do I know this, all of this is mutual knowledge. And suppose that because all of this is mutual knowledge, I go out and buy what I regard as excellent chocolate, and I offer it to you in the manifest intention that you should recognize that I'm doing so in an attempt to meet your chocolateless condition. This situation is exactly parallel to the situation that Hinchman is talking about, only it doesn't involve a speech act. It involves the act of giving you chocolate in the manifest intention that you should recognize that I do so to meet your chocolateless condition. Question: when I offer you this chocolate, do you owe it to me to presume that I am good at discriminating good chocolate from bad chocolate? Do you owe it to me to assume that unless you have evidence to the contrary? And what I want to suggest is that the answer is no, you don't owe that to me. I've done nothing to entitle myself to your regarding me as a good chocolate discriminator. And if that's true in the good chocolate case, I don't see why the case of telling is any different. And if that's correct, I think Hinchman's answer to the entitlement question isn't right. For the same reason, I think his answer to the harm question is false. His answer to the harm question is that when the expectation is violated, the harm to the speaker is that of having the invitation rebuffed. Is that the kind of harm that's in play when I tell you something and you utterly reject it on the basis of no evidence whatsoever? Well, it's not clear to me. If I offer you chocolate, do you harm me if you decide not to accept my offer on the basis of no reasons whatsoever? Not because you think I'm not good at discriminating good chocolate, but just because you don't want to accept my offer. I think the answer there is no. You may owe me a polite no thank you, but I don't think you've harmed me if you reject my offer, even if you have no reasons for doing so whatsoever. So I think his answer to the harm question is also false. And then when we get to the epistemology question, you will have anticipated my answer. If you consider when I offer you chocolate in the manifest intention of meeting your chocolateless condition, do you owe it to me to assume that I am reliable in discriminating good chocolate from bad chocolate? The answer is no. And because the answer is no, I think the epistemology question, I think the answer to the epistemology question can't be what Hinchman's theory would lead us to expect. That is to say, merely by offering you my word, that doesn't by itself, even as an invitation to trust, give you a reason to think that my word is to be relied upon, any more than my offering you a piece of chocolate in the manifest intention to meet your chocolateless condition gives you a reason to regard my chocolate discriminating powers as to be relied upon. So I think the answer to the epistemology question is also false. At this point, there is a possible way to save Hinchman's account. And for those of you who know the literature on trust, you will know the move I'm about to make very well. Here I'm appealing to Richard Holton's paper, Deciding to Trust, Coming to Believe. What Holton does in this paper is he proposes, at a certain point in the paper, he proposes that the very act of inviting another person to trust you can do something like generate a reason for them to think that you're trustworthy. Rather than summarize his view, let me quote him. Here's the view that he says in this very, very well-known paper. He says, I might think it appropriate to trust you to do a certain thing only if you invite me to do so. And it might be that very invitation that leads me to think you reliable, since it signals a readiness to take on the responsibilities that my trust would bring. Now, I think this is a really interesting comment, because I think if you combine Holton's account of invitations to Hinchman's invitation to trust model of telling, you get a very interesting hybrid view. What you get is a view that says the following. For S to tell A that P is for S to perform an act in which S commits herself to the truth of P, and S indicates that she stands ready to take on the relevant responsibilities of having the relevant evidence. Why is this interesting? Precisely because what I'm going to call the Hinchman-Holton model purports to give a mechanism whereby invitations to trust generate reasons to believe. And if this model is successful, that is, if Holton is correct that invitations to trust really do generate reasons to believe, then I think we can say that the speaker is entitled to expect that the audience recognize and appreciate the force of those reasons, and that she believe on the basis of those reasons unless she has stronger reasons not to do so. And if all of this is correct, it looks like Hinchman has everything that he could possibly want, because now it looks like the speaker is entitled to expect to be presumed trustworthy, precisely because the speaker is entitled to expect that the audience will recognize the reasons that she's being given. And furthermore, because the invitation to trust is generating reasons to believe, it looks like we're going to have an answer to the epistemology question as well. Because it looks like, in this case, one and the same act, conceived as an act of inviting another person to trust one, both generates reason for them to believe you and generates the expectation that you be presumed trustworthy. So it looks like we have everything an account could possibly want. But there's an important fly in the ointment. In fact, this is what I regard as one of the more important lessons of the testimony literature in the early 2000s. Namely, that this approach to testimony conflates two very different kinds of reason. First, what I'm going to call practical reasons to hold a speaker responsible in a certain way. And secondly, epistemic reasons to believe that the speaker is in fact responsible in that way. It's rather easy to see that these are very different things. Here's a case. My kids tell me that they will be home at midnight tonight. Let's suppose they have a terrible track record. They never get home when they say they're going to get home. But when midnight comes and goes and they show up at 1:30 a.m., I say to them, I'm very upset with you. You told me that you would be home at midnight. There, it's clear to me that I'm relying on the reasons that they gave me to hold them responsible. I may not have had any reason to believe them given their track record, but I am relying on the fact that they gave me a reason to hold them responsible. They entitled me to hold them responsible. What this suggests is that tellings, whatever else they do, it's clear that they generate reasons for the audience to hold the speaker responsible. What's not clear is whether they also at the same time generate epistemic reasons to believe that the speaker is responsible. And yet that's exactly what Hinchman and Holton need. And I'm suggesting that nothing in the mechanisms that they have proposed suggest how we get these epistemic reasons. At best, what they've shown us is how we get practical reasons to hold the speaker responsible, not epistemic reasons to believe that they are. So the final report card on Hinchman, I have to say, I think it gets at least 3 of our 4 questions wrong. I haven't given you an argument for his answer to the content question. I will get to that. I'm leaving the harm question unmarked because I think there is something very, very insightful in what he has to say about the nature of the harm. I'll come back to that towards the end. Let me now move from the invitation to trust model to another model that perhaps may be even more familiar to those of you who know the testimony literature, and that is the assurance model. And this one was made famous by Richard Moran, first in the 2006 paper that I cited earlier, but more recently in a 2019 book called The Exchange of Words, Speech, Testimony, and Intersubjectivity. Here's what Moran has to say in both the article and in the book. He says, telling someone something is not simply giving expression to what's on your mind, but is making a statement with the understanding that here it is your word that is to be relied on. The speaker, in presenting his utterance as an assertion, one with the force of telling the audience something, presents himself as accountable for the truth of what he says, and in doing so, he offers a kind of guarantee for this truth. Now, I call this a promising model of telling. I intend the wordplay. It's promising in 2 senses. One, as I'm about to go on to argue, I think this is a better theory. It goes a little bit further than Hinchman's theory. In that sense, it's more promising than Hinchman's is. But secondly, whereas Hinchman conceived of the act of telling or the act of asserting as involving an invitation to trust, Moran seems to think of the act of asserting as involving something like an act of promising. He doesn't use the word promising, he uses the word guaranteeing, but a guarantee is a kind of promise. And to be sure, Moran himself doesn't go into great detail about how guaranteeing someone that you have the truth generates a reason for them to believe that you do have the truth. But here we can go for help to one of Moran's colleagues at Harvard. We can go to Scanlon, who has some very, very interesting and insightful things to say about the nature of promising. Here I'm focusing on the part of Scanlon's view of promising that's supposed to connect up with the idea of generating a reason to believe that the promisor, the one who makes the promise, will do as he or she or they promised. Here's what Scanlon has to say about that. He says, when I say I promise to help you if you help me, the reason I suggest to you that I will have for helping is just my awareness of the fact that not to return your help would, under the normal circumstances, be morally wrong. When I say I promise to be there at 10 o'clock to help you, the effect is the same as if I had said, I will be there at 10 o'clock to help you, trust me. In either of these utterances, as the quote goes on to say, I do several things. I claim to have a certain intention. I make this claim with the clear aim of getting you to believe that I have this intention, and I do this in circumstances in which it's clear that if you do believe it, then the truth of this belief will matter to you, perhaps, but not necessarily, because you may rely upon it in deciding what to do. Finally, I indicate to you that I believe and take seriously the fact that once I have declared this intention under the circumstances and have reason to believe that you are convinced by it, it would be wrong of me not to show up in the absence of some truly compelling reason for failing to appear. And so what I want to do here is I want to do the same thing. I want to have Scanlon do the same thing for Moran that earlier I had Holton do for Hinchman, namely try to supplement the view so that it actually does generate a reason for the audience to believe. And here I want to suggest that Scanlon's model of promising applied to Moran's promising model of telling goes something like this. For S to tell A that P is for S to perform an act in which X commits herself to the truth of P, S indicates that she stands ready to take on the relevant responsibilities of having the relevant evidence, etc. And S indicates her recognition that it would be morally wrong of her to fail in connection with these responsibilities. You will be aware that the first two of these conditions is exactly what we had in Moran. It's this third condition that's the new condition. The idea is that I not only indicate to you that I stand ready, I also indicate to you that it would be morally wrong of me not to live up to my responsibilities. This is what Moran, I think, is adding to Hinchman. What I want to suggest is that this, just like the Hinchman view, Moran's Scanlon-enhanced model of assurance is trying to provide us with the mechanisms whereby acts of assurance generate reasons to believe. And if they do, then we're in a nice situation, because in that case, the speaker would be entitled to expect that the audience recognize and appreciate the force of those reasons and believe on the basis of those reasons, unless she has stronger reasons not to do so. And as I mentioned with respect to Hinchman, if all of this works out, it looks like the assurance model gives us everything that we could possibly want. But Moran anticipates an objection, and it's worthwhile spending a minute or two on this objection. Moran, in both the paper and the book, writes the following: if it seems difficult to see how anything, even someone's words, could acquire some epistemic value through something like conferral, that is, through the act of assurance. The idea is assurance confers epistemic significance on the very act that's being performed. If that seems difficult to see, it should be remembered that for both parties, this conferral is by its nature an overt assumption of specific responsibilities on the part of the speaker. This is no more or less mysterious than how an explicit agreement or contract alters one's responsibilities. I want to suggest that at this point, the resulting account suffers from exactly the same conflation that the Hinchman-Holton theory had been a victim of. Namely, the theory is supposed to be that the act of assuring generates a reason for the audience to believe that the speaker has fulfilled her responsibilities that her act of assurance morally requires of her. But this again conflates two different kinds of reasons, the very two kinds of reasons that I talked about previously: practical reasons to hold a speaker responsible and epistemic reasons to believe that the speaker will in fact be responsible. Why didn't Moran see this? Here's my speculative hypothesis. Because if you and I contract with one another, if we actually sit down and make a contract, that's because we already had reason either to regard the other person as reliable or to regard the enforcement mechanisms, the legal enforcement mechanisms, as sufficiently well defended to make sure that our interests will be protected in case you don't live up to your responsibility. Contracting, all that it does is it gives you the right to hold another person responsible. It doesn't also at the same time generate a reason for you to believe that they will be responsible. And we miss this when we fail to appreciate that typically we won't contract with someone unless we had antecedent reasons to believe that they would do as they contracted. So what do we say about Moran's view here? His answer to the content question is the same as Hinchman's answer, and I think that it's wrong for exactly the same reason. I haven't yet given you my argument for that. His answer to the entitlement question is something like this: the speaker's entitlement to expect to be presumed trustworthy is based on the fact that she offered the audience her assurance, thereby indicating her recognition that it is her moral duty to have lived up to the associated responsibilities. Well, what I'm suggesting is that assurance doesn't entitle, if you assure someone of something, that doesn't entitle you to be presumed trustworthy, precisely because it doesn't generate a reason for them, an epistemic reason for them to believe that you are trustworthy. All it does is it generates a practical reason for them to hold you responsible. So I think that the answer to the entitlement question is not correct. The harm question is an interesting one. I think Moran's answer to that is something like this: when this expectation is violated, the harm to the speaker is that of having one's promise or guarantee not be accepted. I think there is something right about that, and I'm going to come back to that when I offer my own view. And then finally, the answer to the epistemology question, for the reasons that I already anticipated, I think this gets the epistemology question wrong as well. The problem is that it tries to pack in epistemic significance into the very act of assurance, but in so doing, it conflates the fact that assurance gives one practical reasons to hold someone responsible for the claim that it needs which is that assurance generates epistemic reasons to believe that the person is responsible. And because of that conflation, I think it gets the epistemology question wrong as well. So at this point, we need a hero. At this point, we need to change things up a bit. And the hero of my story is Miranda Fricker. And it's the Fricker of epistemic injustice. But I have to say, it's not the official view that you get in epistemic injustice, because unfortunately, the official view borrows too much from Moran. In fact, if you read that book, what you'll find is that Fricker follows Moran very closely in her answer to content and entitlement, the content question and the entitlement question. So her official view is not what I'm after. What I'm after is the better view that I think is such that all of the materials to make that better view are in her book. And what I'm going to do is try to use that better view to reconceive the expectation of proper treatment. Here's the thought. One of Fricker's core insights in this book, and I'm assuming that most of you have read the book. One of her core insights is that cases of epistemic injustice are cases in which a hearer wrongs a speaker in his capacity as a giver of knowledge or as an informant. My hypothesis, inspired by Fricker, is that a speaker's expectation of proper treatment is an expectation to be treated as one who occupies the status of a giver of knowledge. And what I'm going to do in this part of my talk is just unpack what it means to expect to be treated as a giver of knowledge. Let's begin with the question, what is a giver of knowledge? That can't be a person who gives knowledge on this particular occasion, because you can be a giver of knowledge even if you make mistakes. This is a point that Fricker herself is very adamant about, and I think she's right about this. So a giver of knowledge is not one who always gives others knowledge. Rather, we need a more indirect way to get at what a giver of knowledge is. And I'm going to begin with a job description. This is the job description that I'm going to claim a giver of knowledge purports to do. The job is that of presenting a content as true in such a way that were the audience to accept it on the basis of accepting that speech contribution, the audience's resulting belief would be a candidate for knowledge. That's a job. You can fulfill that job or fail to fulfill that job, but that's a job to be done. Why do I speak about a candidate for knowledge rather than A's resulting belief would be knowledge? Well, that's because A herself may have background reasons that make it irrational for her to accept S's testimony, or A may be in a situation that is a Gettier situation. That's a problem that will prevent A from acquiring knowledge, but that problem does not prevent S from doing her part as a speaker. And that's why I want to say that the part that S plays in a testimonial transaction is this particular job. That's the part that S does. I'm going to call this the job of informing. Some of you may quibble, those of you who do speech act theory may quibble with me here. You may call this, you may say, look, you don't really inform someone unless they actually believe you and they come to thereby know. If that's your view, I would call this the job of informing star. I'm not going to quibble on that. I'm going to, for the purposes of today, I'm just going to call this the job of informing. And I'm going to call a speaker who purports to do this job a testifier. And finally, I'm going to call a speaker who has the capacity to testify and who sometimes succeeds in the job of informing a giver of knowledge. That's precisely what a giver of knowledge is. It's somebody who has the capacity to testify and who sometimes succeeds in the job in question. And if that's right, then I want to suggest that for people like you and me, giving testimony, or if you prefer telling, however you want to call this, is a manifestation of one's status as a giver of knowledge. Now, this has dramatic implications for our answer to the content question. What I want to suggest now is that we should construe the speaker's expectation of proper treatment not with Hinchman and Moran as the expectation to be presumed trustworthy, but rather as the expectation to be recognized as purporting to be trustworthy. To use the language that Tim Williamson uses in his very influential book on assertion, the expectation to be recognized as representing oneself as trustworthy. That's what I have in mind by purporting, something like this. If that is the expectation of proper treatment, we can now present a Fricker-inspired approach to the content question and the entitlement question that goes something like this. A speaker who performs an act that purports to do the informing job. In other words, to speak colloquial English, a speaker who testifies does something which yields common knowledge. And it yields a lot of common knowledge. Three aspects of that common knowledge are going to be interesting to me. First, the speaker who performs this job yields common knowledge of the success conditions for an act of this kind. So if I testify, I have done something regarding which it's common knowledge that what I have done is successful if and only if I meet certain conditions. Which conditions? The conditions given in the job description for the act of informing. Secondly, if I testify, I do something which yields common knowledge regarding the epistemic properties that my act must have if it is to have been a successful example of this job. In particular, I had to have done the informing job itself. Not merely did I purport to do it, but I actually had to do that job itself. What was that job? It was that of having presented a proposition as true to you in such a way that if you believe on the basis of accepting my speech contribution, you are in a position to know. Your belief is, as it were, puts you in a position to know. In order for me to do that job, my act itself must have certain epistemic properties. For example, if I simply guess and my guess is true and you believe me, your belief is true, but is not knowledgeable. In fact, it can't be knowledge because you depended on what in fact was a lucky guess. In order for my speech contribution to be the thing that puts you in a position to know, I have to have testified in a way that's either reliable or knowledgeable. This is a debate in the literature that I'm not going to get into. All I want to say is that there have to be certain epistemic features that my testimony had in order to have, for me to have done my job successfully. And then third, if I testify, I do something which yields common knowledge regarding what I convey to you in performing that act. And here I'm borrowing from a really lovely idea that goes back at least to the late 1980s. I'm sure it goes back further. There was a lovely paper by a fellow by the name of Angus Ross, who wrote that when we human beings participate in rule-governed life, what we do in participating in an activity governed by rules is we convey to everyone that we are following the rules. So if I'm doing something that has success conditions, and there are rules for how you actually meet those success conditions, then in the very act of testifying, I convey to you that I'm following the rules. That is, the rules that would make my act a successful piece of testimony. My thought is that all of this is common knowledge when a speaker purports to inform. All of that is common knowledge. If that's right, I want to generate a couple of key claims. First, one who performs an act in which she presents P as true, while simultaneously conveying that she has the relevant epistemic authority, as it were, regarding P's truth, is one who purports to inform. And one who purports to inform is owed the sort of respect due to one who conveys having the requisite epistemic authority. Merely conveying having the epistemic authority entitles me to a certain kind of respect in my audience. This is true not just of me, it's true of anyone who purports to inform, and that is going to be the basis of entitlement. So now we can come up with a full theory, what I call a Fricker-inspired model, for how we answer all four questions. One who performs an act of this sort, that is one who purports to perform the informing job, will expect to be recognized as having conveyed her own relevant epistemic authority on the matter at hand, and she will expect to be treated accordingly, more on which in a moment. She's entitled to expect as much in virtue of what is common knowledge when she performs the act. That's the common knowledge I just talked about. She's disrespected by her audience when they do not properly epistemically assess her conveyed claim of epistemic authority. And finally, in performing this act, she puts her audience under pressure to conform to the standards of epistemology in their doxastic reaction to her testimony. This, I think, is a Fricker-inspired model for answering all four of our questions, all four of the questions that we wanted to answer. So the remaining questions that we have to answer is, how in the world do speakers pull all of this off? This was a very, very complicated theory that I just gave you, using lots of bells and whistles. How do speakers pull it off? In particular, is there a speech act that can do the trick? Secondly, how do audiences recognize such speech acts? And this is the last section of my paper, brief section. I call this my Fricker-inspired account. This is the account that I developed at some length in the 2020 book, Conversational Pressure, and it goes something like this. I make two assumptions. First assumption, I assume the knowledge rule of assertion. This, of course, is one that was defended very, very ably by Tim Williamson, among others. It goes something like this. Assertion is the unique speech act that is governed by a rule to the effect that one must assert that P only if one knows that P. If you want, you can get rid of that assert and just put perform this act with the content that P only if one knows that P. And second assumption that I'm making, I'm assuming that the knowledge rule of assertion is implicit common knowledge among all pragmatically competent speakers. That is to say, I'm assuming that something like KRA itself is what constitutes part of our pragmatic competence in speaking a language. This is why you and I count as understanding what an assertion is, because we implicitly grasp something like that rule. If all of these two assumptions are true, then we can account for how speakers pull off a speech act in which they purport to do the job described above. Namely, they make assertions. That's all you have to do. How is it that merely by making an assertion, you pull off that job? Well, if assertion is governed by a rule that requires that you have knowledge, and you perform an act of that kind that you convey to the audience that you in fact are following the rule, and so are knowledgeable, and in conveying to them that you are knowledgeable, you are then entitled to the kind of respect that's deserved by somebody who conveys being knowledgeable, and you also put them under pressure to assess you epistemically, because as it were, you're announcing the epistemic properties of your act in the very act of performing it. Secondly, we can account for the content of the speaker's expectation of proper treatment. I expect that you will, when I assert, I expect that you'll recognize me as having purported to have been knowledgeable. I am purporting to be knowledgeable, and I expect to be recognized as such, and I expect to be treated as such. I'll get to that in a second. Finally, we can account for how it is that the speech act in question is easily recognized by an audience. All you have to do is to distinguish assertions from non-assertions, and you've recognized the speech act in question. Here then is the final report card. What about the content question? The view that I want to defend is that the content of proper treatment is the expectation to be treated with the sort of respect that's owed to one who manifests her status as a giver of knowledge. The sort of respect that is due is to treat the speech contribution as purporting to inform. And what this involves is that the audience must tailor their doxastic response to a proper epistemic assessment of the speech contribution understood as a contribution that purports to inform. That is, understood as a contribution in which the audience conveys having the relevant epistemic authority. That, I think, is the right answer to the content question. What about the entitlement question? I want to suggest the speaker's entitlement to expect this kind of treatment derives from what's common knowledge when one makes an assertion. That's what I tried to defend about 10 minutes ago. What about the harm question? Well, when this expectation is violated, the harm to the speaker is a form of disrespect. The disrespect targets the speaker in her status as a giver of knowledge, thereby calling into question one or both of two things, either her competence at assessing her own reasons or her sincerity in expressing that assessment. And then finally, I want to say that we now have an answer to the epistemology question, because given that assertion purports to inform and that it's governed by KRA, that is the knowledge rule of assertion, assertion provides epistemic support to belief by indicating to the audience that the speaker purports to be knowledgeable, requiring the audience to conform to epistemic standards in her doxastic response, where these standards will be given by a proper account of the epistemology of testimony. And I think that is the answer to the epistemology question. In conclusion, I want to suggest that speakers are entitled to certain normative expectations of their audience, that the quotes with which I began are in fact true, but that we should not understand these expectations as an expectation to be believed or to be presumed trustworthy. That's the wrong way to think about this expectation, precisely because while performing a testimony constituting speech act entitles one's audience to hold one responsible, it doesn't also generate epistemic reasons to believe that one is responsible. Rather, we should understand the speaker's normative expectations of her audience as an expectation to be respected as a giver of knowledge, that is, as one who is purporting to be knowledgeable, and so as one who is purporting to be trustworthy. One virtue of this account is that it's neutral with respect to one's preferred epistemology of testimony. I regard that as a virtue because it means that the kind of proposal I offer today can be offered to anyone, no matter what background views you have in the epistemology of testimony. And with that, I will stop and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldberg, for this excellent talk. So now we will proceed with the Q&A. If you have a question, please send me a private message. Well, I would say it in Spanish too. Bueno, ahora procederemos con el espacio de retroalimentación de preguntas y respuestas. Recuerden que el profesor Goldberg dijo que admitiría preguntas que se formulen en español. Entonces, quien quiera, por favor, enviarme un mensaje privado con la letra Q y procederemos en orden a dar la palabra. Entonces, vamos a ver. Tenemos en primer lugar el caso de Felipe Madeiros. Entonces, so we have the first person in the Q&A would be Felipe Madeiros, sorry. So you can proceed to ask your question.
Hi, Sandy.
Good to see you, Felipe.
Yeah, you too. So I'm going to make a familiar point, and then I don't know if it's going to be the same thing that it was earlier tempted to say, but I'm worried that if you're trying to give everything that you want to say about assertion in terms of telling, then it seems that you're not. Okay, sorry. So it seems that you're going to have an issue to explain the hero testimony cases if you want to go this way, because like on those cases, whereas the speaker doesn't have all the features that he's entitled to expect, it seems like the hero does, right? Everything that you want to say about the speaker in those cases, you can say about the hero. But in those cases, well, the speaker is not purporting to inform anyone because, he's not telling anyone anything. So if you're trading just on telling to give the explanation that you want to do, it seems like you're going to have to tell a different story about those cases. And that can be an issue. I don't know.
Good.
What do you want to say about that? Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Felipe. So let me just, because I don't know that everyone knows this literature, by hearer testimony cases, Felipe is talking about a case that my colleague Jennifer Lackey has given. These are cases in which an audience will actually regard something as testimony, even though the speaker may not ever have intended it to be testimony. So that's the kind of case that Felipe is worried about. And he's worried that if I construe my understanding of assertion on the model of telling, then I won't be able to understand the normative dimensions of those cases. And what I want to say in response, Felipe, is that you got me exactly backwards. I want to understand telling in terms of assertion. I think assertion is the notion that I understand better. Telling is a special case of asserting. So assertion carries with it lots of normative features. I've tried to give you some sense today of what those normative features are, but the idea is that we can piggyback an account of telling on an account of asserting. And I think if I do that, then hearer testimony cases don't present a problem. But you'll let me know if you think I'm wrong about that.
Felipe, do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, we can talk later about this, but it seems like at least like the condition that you gave as the one that the speaker has to purport to be an informer is going to be violated in those cases, and at least that should be an argument for like trying to abandon that, I think. But anyway, that's a bigger discussion.
Good. Yeah. To be continued then, because I think you and I have disagreed about this kind of case, and I won't rehash it now. I'll see if there are other questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have a question by Mario Solis, so you can proceed.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Goldberg, for this wonderful talk. I go in English, and if I need Spanish, I go for it as well. And I have to say that I don't really know much about the literature you're working with, and so this information, apologies for that in advance. I'm trying to make a question regarding the idea of something that might be missing. I don't know if that is the case or not, and that is the background question, if you wish. I'm calling that the facts, if you wish. So you're talking about conversations and you're talking about assertions, but and you're talking about content, the harm question or the epistemic question, but the facts, and that is what I'm interested in, the facts that gives us reason to engage in conversation. So that's missing. You know, in peace accords in Colombia, for instance, in this kind of conversation, which is hard, it has to do with the hard facts as well, right? So how is it that piece is not coming up? That's especially because you're talking about testimony and testimony cases, and that is very relevant there. And second point is it's a comment, and I don't know what you can do whatever you want about that comment, but I'm thinking about an account, and I came out to me that you can say, or one can say that I don't have a name for this, but the right way to go has to do with something like this. It's in the effort in purporting, that is the verb you use, to make sense of what we believe in by making sense of what others believe. And I find that a key point in all this conversation, which might be very relevant also in terms of testimony and, you know, these kind of conversations for grief and memory and, you know, grievances such as those people have lived in Colombia, for instance.
Beautiful. Mario, thank you very much. I also deeply appreciate your attempt to bring this down to earth to real important questions like hard political conversations in Colombia. I very much appreciate that. Your first question, I'm not entirely sure I got the second question, but I think I got the first question. It was, where are the facts? And I need to tell you just a brief story to give you a sense of what's going on here. I am by training a person who is an epistemologist, and I was interested in testimony in part because I became convinced that we acquire a good many of our most important pieces of knowledge through accepting what other people tell us. What I realized in reading this literature, the literature that I started out with today, is that testimony at the same time is also rich with interpersonal normativity. That is, we offend each other when we, either when we say things or when we respond to what we say. What I was trying to do today was to say how you could account for both of those things at once. Where are the facts? The facts are required if I'm going to do the informing job. If I'm seriously going to inform you as opposed to misinform you or malinform you, then I've got to have my epistemic house in order. I've got to, if you like, I've got to know the facts. I've got to be onto the facts, and that has to inform what I tell you. That's where the facts are. I didn't mention them today because you were right. They were in the deep background. But they're there. They have to be there, because if they're not there, then you can't make sense of my notion of informing. Let me stop there just to see if that's okay before I get to question number 2.
Yeah, about the question number 1, that's okay. Yeah, I think that is quite important. And then is that perhaps what I want to say also related to that is that it's not only that we need the facts, is that facts speak so loud.
Yeah.
Is that factor of the equation, or that part of the equation, if you wish.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to talk about the 4 years that my country just went through when it came to our previous head of state, who I will not name. But there is where I absolutely find myself agreeing with you. We've got to have facts in the picture, or else we're going to be susceptible to kind of individuals like that man, whom I will not name.
Great.
Your second question was, I wasn't quite sure what it was. It was, we need to make sense of what others are saying in order to make sense of the world. Was it something like that?
We have to make sense of what we believe in by making sense of what others believe. So it's a job. I'm going to be trustworthy and truthful, say. Let's talk about truthfulness here. So you're going to do that, but in doing that, you have also to do this. You have to believe in, you have to try to make sense of what others believe too. So that might be a key. And again, this is just something that comes out of this presentation, and I'm not so sure where to put it. My question is where to put that.
Let me see if I can put it somewhere, Mario, and see if this gets at what you're thinking. And if it's not, I apologize. The failure of understanding is on me, and I'll maybe we can follow up later. But your thought is this, and I certainly agree with you, that if I'm going to make sense of you or you're going to make sense of me, each one of us can only do this from the perspective that we currently occupy. That's absolutely correct. That is to say, when we come to a testimonial encounter, we come at it already with lots of beliefs that are our background beliefs, and that a successful account of a testimonial transaction had better take that into account. I think you're right about that. I think that the theory that I've offered today does that, although I didn't actually make it explicit. The thought is that if I'm going to be rational and taking you at your word, then I had better be entitled to regard you as reliable. And how am I going to figure out whether you're reliable? Well, I'm going to rely on my background information, my background beliefs. That's where I think a lot of this enters into the picture. It also enters into the picture when I interpret what you've said, the content of what you've said. So it enters in at least those two dimensions, and it may enter as well more. I should say also from your perspective in being my audience, you're doing the same thing. You would bring your background beliefs into the testimonial exchange and evaluating me with reference to those.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will proceed with the question by Professor Paul Bogosian. So you now have the word.
Thank you. Hey, thanks, Sandy. That was a terrific talk.
Thank you, Paul.
It got me interested in this literature I've been avoiding. It's always a great sign about a talk that it does that effect. So because, as I say, I haven't really gotten into that literature that much, I'm going to ask the naive question, one that I'm sure has come up in connection with thinking of the knowledge norm on assertion, whether that's the correct norm. That it does play a key role, I guess, in your view, because it's giver of knowledge and purporting to inform are taken to be equivalent. So is this a deontological norm of a kind such that if I violate it, you know, I have done something wrong and I can be held responsible for that? Because if it does, it implies that if I took every precaution possible and gave you something that was 99.99% likely to be true given the evidence, in fact, so stunningly obvious, that it was my responsibility to share it with you. But then it just turned out we were in a radical skeptical scenario and it came out false. Have I violated a norm on assertion in telling you this thing?
So that's, Paul, this is a great question, and it's the kind of really lovely question that I've come to expect from you. So I really appreciate that you're pushing me on this. The short answer is that yes, it is. The longer answer is just an attempt to suggest things aren't perhaps as bad as you suggest. But what I'm about to tell you are things you've already thought of, but I'll mention them anyway, just so we can get the discussion going. I do here follow Tim in thinking that this norm is a constitutive norm. That means it's actually constitutive of the practice. You're not actually participating in the practice unless you're purporting to follow that norm. That means that if you violate it, you are thereby downgradable as an asserter. You rightly note that you can violate it through no fault of your own. And I absolutely agree with you on this. But I would also suggest that there are lots of rules which are such that you can violate them through no fault of your own. Here's the one that epistemologists love. I think you know this one as well as I do. It was given by Feldman some time back. I write you a check out of my checking account, unbeknownst to me, and through no culpable ignorance on my part. My partner emptied my check account this morning. So I have violated a rule. Don't write a check that you can't cover with your checking account. I think that is the rule. I think that's a deontological rule, and I violated it through no fault of my own. So what I want to suggest is that the proper way to handle these cases is that we need a very subtle account of blameless rule violation. And you will know this better than I do because this is your area more than it is mine. There are lots of different moves that one can make within that category of blameless rule violation. It strikes me that Tim this morning in his talk was actually going over one of those, but that's my thought on this one.
Right. No, the thing is, you see, we already know that because we have to account for our blameless fallibility, that the norm on belief were truth, then you can very justifiably believe what's false. That's what it is to be fallible, and you can't guard against all these skeptical scenarios. But what we're arguing about here is whether we need 2 layers of deontological norm or just 1 layer. And we know what the phenomena are. All you've done is, instead of I say you justifiably said something false or believed something false, and what Tim wants to say is you blamelessly but irrationally believed something false. So the normative notions are just being kind of thrown around without, I think, any very clear advantage of one over the other.
So I want to agree with your last point in the following sense that, first of all, you're quite right that I analyze it this way. One of the interesting things about Tim's talk this morning, and I will say the really interesting thing is a thing that he shares in common with Maria Lawson and Arnio, is that he doesn't have to rest content with just blameless rule violation. His thought today, as I understood him, was you can have something like a general competence. This was the general norm rather than the local norm. You can have a general competence that leads you wrong in particular cases. To say that it's a general competence is precisely to give a term of praise. What I'm thinking is, your point is correct. I've not given you any reason today to think that this is the right way to go. I would owe you independent reasons to think that this is a better way to go. All I've done today is suggest to you, if you go this way, you actually have a number of virtues that you get in the debate that I was contributing to. I also think you have other independent reasons to want to go this way. That's a longer story. I've tried to give them in other work.
I'll just say one
sure.
Flag. I thought of further conversation just to flag it. The question is what you lose if you substitute justified information as opposed to knowledge from your account. I don't see that you would actually lose any of the normativity.
Good. So I will tell you, I wasn't going to bring this in because it only complicates things further. My official view on assertion is that knowledge isn't the norm. The norm is a context-sensitive one. I think you and I have talked about this.
Okay.
But for the purposes of today, and in fact, I think even with a context-sensitive norm, you can make sense of informing. But for the purpose of today, I wanted to accept the stronger view. You've put a nice flag in there, and I hope one day, either in New York or Chicago or some beautiful place in Europe, we will be able to, or in South or Central America, we will be able to talk about it further.
Very good. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Now we have a question by Marisela Rojas. So you may proceed. Marisela, do you hear us? Okay, so she's just about to ask her question.
Hello, I wrote my answer, but we need to be clear. Of course, if we are responding to the question about possibility or processing knowledge, a testimony is knowledge, of course, and it is valid because the object and the intention is another. But if we are responding to the question about validity of knowledge, it is very different. We need a clear ontological or coherent reference. And in addition, the guiltiness of knowing is not acceptable at all in epistemology. We can feel guilty of developing and searching and have knowledge. We need to have truths. Excuse my English is very, very bad. I speak better French, excuse me. It's not acceptable to feel guilty about knowledge. Excuse me to be so clear in this point. There are two different questions if we are responding about processing knowledge or if we are responding about validity of knowledge. Thank you.
Maricela, thank you very much. I'm going to reply, but I don't know that I fully understood your question. And if I didn't, please tell me that I did not understand, and I will try to do a better job with my answer. You're asking about whether we are talking about processing knowledge or evaluating the validity of knowledge. For the purposes today, I was actually talking, I think, primarily about the second of those two. So the idea is that when I tell you something, your task is to determine whether or not I know what I'm talking about. And if you evaluate me successfully, then your evaluation will be correct. You will know that I know what I'm talking about when I know what I'm talking about. And you will know that I don't know what I'm talking about when I don't know what I'm talking about. That is an evaluative task. You are evaluating my testimony. That's my answer. I apologize. I didn't quite understand what you had in mind with the guilt of knowing. It struck me as an intriguing thought, but I didn't quite follow you there.
Okay. Then
you want to try to ¿Quiere hablarme en español? Si es más fácil. Pero muy despacio, que me cuesta muchísimo.
¿Es más fácil francés o español?
Español, francés no.
Es peligroso confundir con relativismo las posiciones sobre el testimonio, que por supuesto es válido desde el punto de vista del procesamiento del conocimiento, pero también desde el punto de vista del le partage, del compartir el conocimiento es fundamental incluso. Sin embargo, sería sumamente peligroso confundirlo con el problema de la validez del conocimiento. En este sentido, los testimonios tienen que ser tienen que tener una referencia tanto ontológica como en coherencia lógica. La culpabilidad, hablo de la culpabilidad porque esto está en el fondo, está muy escondido en muchas posiciones de moda en este momento. Sin embargo, todos estos problemas, these topics aren't new. They were traded 60 years ago. They were traded by positions, very solid positions like Piagetian position. And it's not acceptable to ignore this different when we trade the methodology of knowledge, that testimony is a kind of methodology of knowledge. And we cannot ignore these positions that have more than 70 years of research, like Piagetian theory, that we know he's the most important epistemologist in the 20th century. We cannot ignore this. To ignore this is a joke. These topics were treated 60 years ago, and we have to know these positions and this research is my point of view. Okay, disculpe si mi inglés no es nada bueno.
No,
My French is better. My French is really better.
Okay, your French may be better, but my French is très terrible, so I could not understand you at all. So Maricela, this is what I will say, and please forgive me. As I mentioned, I'm going to respond in English so that everyone can understand. When you talk about the Piagetian theory of knowledge, you are right that I have not been attending to that at all. However, and you're also right that I have not been talking today about, if you like, what knowledge is. That's also something that I have not been talking about. I've been assuming that we have some sense of what knowledge is, and I've been using that in an attempt to clarify what you rightly point out is what you called it, I think, a knowledge process. Testimony is a knowledge process. It's a way that you can come to acquire knowledge. So that is all correct. My hope would be, and this, if you like, this is the way that I would try to sell this position to you. My hope would be that by not engaging in the questions that you're really urging me to engage in, I'm able to do other work that I think is interesting, leaving for another day the very important questions that you rightly pointed out. That's what I would say in an attempt to hopefully convince you that there was something to the talk, even though I ignored what you had hoped I would talk about.
Okay, thank you so much.
No sé si me explico.
Sí. Muchas gracias, muy amable.
A usted.
Okay, so before ending, I wanted to ask a couple of questions, but I'm not sure if they're good questions. So, okay, I think, well, I'm not sure if this applies to all the different alternatives that you discussed, or maybe just to the invitation to trust model, but for example, when the speaker is supposed to have authority and is supposed to have evidence, is this evidence supposed to be available directly to the audience too? And the like, yes, or for example, would the testimony of the expert give reasons to believe the proposition in question to the audience for the sake of just being the testimony of this speaker, or it would depend on the evidence that he would be basing. Well, yes, that he would be basing his assertion actually. So yeah, I think I'm not formulating it right. Just the question is, if would you say that the mere fact that an expert is, or in this case the speaker is saying something, does that also give evidence to the audience to believe in that, apart from the reasons that the speaker is holding for the belief?
So Luis, I have to tell you, you asked one of the questions that goes to the very heart of the epistemology of testimony. I can give you my view, but I want to flag that my view is one view among many. There are many views on this matter. Let me start off with the invitation to trust model. The invitation to trust model thinks that the very act of inviting you to trust me gives you a reason to believe me. So the very act of inviting you to trust generates the reason. Independent of my background reasons, it generates that reason. What I was worried about today is that it doesn't do that. So in a way, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that if a speaker herself doesn't have reasons, then in fact, her testimony is not going to generate a reason, or at least not generate a reason of the high quality that we want when we rely on other speakers. That's my view. I should tell you, Luis, it is a controversial view in the epistemology of testimony. So I just want to flag that, lest you think that this is the view. Many people disagree about their answer to your very nice question.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Goldberg. Now we have a couple more questions. First, we have a question by Jose David Hidalgo, so the word goes to him.
Okay, thank you so much for your speech, Professor. It was amazing for me.
Thank you.
It is quite a motivation to study these topics. My question is the next one. What sort of conditions should the speaker satisfy in order for him to be considered by the audience as a giver of knowledge?
What sort of conditions does the speaker need to satisfy if he is to be considered a giver of knowledge? That's your question?
Yes, that's my question.
Good. So I'm going to distinguish between a giver of knowledge and a testifier. A giver of knowledge is someone who can testify. In order for me to have a sense of whether you are a giver of knowledge, I need to know whether you are a language-producing creature. Do you speak a language that has speech acts like that of assertion? My impression is that I'm going to regard you as a giver of knowledge as long as you satisfy those conditions. It's a different question how I should regard you as a testifier on those occasions when you testify, because then when I say to you, the New York Yankees won their last game. You are treating me not only as a giver of knowledge, but now as a testifier who has told you something. Then you are going to ask not just whether I'm not just whether I'm a giver of knowledge, but whether I know what I'm talking about on this occasion. And in order for me to know what I'm talking about, I have to have the knowledge that I purported to express in each. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. But my question is, I mean, it's okay, but how can the audience assume that you are giving knowledge to the audience, that you are alleged? Yes, that's my question.
You shouldn't assume that. You should never assume that. You should. So you remember what the theory is. The theory is, if I purport to inform you, what that does is it signals to you that I'm a testifier. It signals to you that I'm representing myself as knowledgeable, and it puts on you the task of assessing whether I am as I'm representing myself to be. That's on you. How do you do this? Well, you use whatever, I mean, this is the question of epistemology of testimony. You use whatever background information you have, whatever you get in the exchange, your knowledge about the kind of context that I'm speaking in, your knowledge about what I told you and how plausible it is. You use all of that to assess whether I am as I purport to be. That's what you have to do.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Now the next question goes to Lorenzo. So please ask your question.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you very much, Professor Goddard, for your talk. I found it too very, very interesting.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the question that Luis posed. So there can be many different situations, many different relations between people, no? Involving testimony and the ontology, right? Many different social relations, many different personal relations, degrees of knowledge, and so on, but also very different situations. So it would be quite different if I have to take a decision immediately, or if I think about all the possible interpretation of what you're saying. So it depends a lot on the situation. Under this aspect, we are we enter, so to say, the branch of pragmatics, So this kind of epistemological reflection, how much has to do in common, so in continuity with sociological reflection and psychological reflection, maybe about the structure of the family, I don't know, something similar.
So your question is an excellent one. The way I'm going to try to answer it, Lorenzo, is as follows, and see if this tracks what you have in mind. I've been assuming that the interpersonal dimension of testimony has to do just with a speaker and an audience. What you're pointing out is that's a little naive and abstract, because you always have a particular speaker and a particular audience who might bear many different relations to one another. And so you're right about this. And in the conversational pressure book, in the book itself, what I try to do is I try to suggest that this is the basic case, and that you can build on top of this to include things like when you and I are friends, or when you and I are coworkers, or when you and I are fellow citizens of a certain town, that can be built on top of the basic case. I was trying to describe the basic case first and then build on top of it. But you're quite right about that. And I'm glad you said that, because I do think a lot of the theorizing in this area is abstract in the way that you're worried about. And today I was abstract. In the book, I try to be less abstract by pointing out how you can build on top of it.
No, it's perfectly okay. It's a kind of model. Then we can work on a very simple model for the particular and complex cases.
Yep.
Completely normal. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Thank you so much for your question. Yep. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Now we have a question by Professor Kasia Jaschkult. So please proceed.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. It's the second time I hear you. I heard you once at APA and it was equally fascinating.
Oh, I'm sorry for boring you.
But I don't read the literature generally. But my question is about this invitation to trust, which generates reasons to hold the speaker responsible, or reasons to believe. And I'm just wondering, wouldn't it be more parsimonious to have a model in which they are not mutually exclusive, where you have both. You have some sort of default standard Gricean communication when you have this generating reasons to believe, and you have a wider notion of communication where you have reasons to hold the speaker responsible. And it's not only to be eclectic, but it seems to me that there are other advantages as well. One is that you have defaults and departures from defaults of compensation. And second is that you can manipulate the notion of assertion. You can do something really fascinating with it about sort of degrees and scenarios, as Paul was suggesting earlier.
So I should tell you that I am very, very sympathetic to your idea of wanting to have a simpler theory if I could have it. I'm also very sympathetic to your idea of trying to do as much with Grice as possible. Both of those were motivating factors in writing the book Conversational Pressure. I was trying to do as much with Gricean, if you like, pragmatics as I could. What I concluded, and I would be interested to hear whether I convinced you of this today, what I concluded was that Grice alone, even as amended by things like inviting to trust, doesn't generate the reasons, the epistemic reasons to believe. It would be great if they did. And in fact, I think the authors that I engaged with today think that they do. But what I was trying to argue today is that they don't. And if that's correct, then you will not get, and here's a general lesson of today's talk, you will not get an epistemology of testimony out of an account of the speech act of telling. That strikes me as an important lesson because so many people these days, not just Hinchman and Moran, but others, think that you can get a proper epistemology of testimony out of a proper account of the speech act of telling. The lesson that I want to bring home today is that that hope has not been realized. Nothing that we've seen in the literature actually realizes that because nobody has provided the mechanisms for generating those reasons. If I didn't convince you of that today, I fear one of my main points has failed.
And post-Griceans?
Who do you have in mind?
Well, I don't know, relevance theory.
Yeah, relevance theory as well. I mean, the relevance theorists, I don't think actually generate the reasons. What relevance theory does that's quite interesting is it actually generates the presumption of relevance, which strikes me as something that does have an important role to play in the normative dimension. There, you're absolutely right. What I don't think relevance theory gives you is reasons to believe. Reasons to regard as relevant, perhaps. Reasons to believe, no. In other work, I actually have an argument why you shouldn't assume that the one is the other. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to share that with you.
Okay, I finally understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Since we don't have any more questions, we can end the Q&A now. So once again, thank you very much, Professor Goldberg, for being with us. Now you want to say something?
I just wanted to say thank you to you also for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for such a lovely engagement. Muchas gracias a todo el mundo para escucharme. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you to you. Your presentation was amazing. And thank you all for being here with us and for your time. So now I would just want to make one last announcement. In a little bit more than 50 minutes, we will have the last talks for today. Both are going to be about the philosophy of normativity, but they are going to be offered in Spanish. One of them is going to be offered precisely by Professor Mario Solís. It is entitled Conectividad entre razones, verdad, racionalidad y normatividad. The second one is going to be offered by Professor David Suárez Rivero, and is entitled Acciones, Sistemas Normativos o Creencias, ¿Dónde se fundamenta la violencia? And with that, we will close the activities for today. So I repeat, both of them are going to be offered in Spanish in around 50 minutes. But with this, we end this afternoon section. So thank you all and goodbye.